Kevin. Okay, welcome everyone. I'm David Rammel, editor of Virtualization and Cloud Review, here to moderate the first session of our Microsoft 365 Security and Recovery Summit, brought to you by Druva, Recovery Point, and Metallic. Before we start today's three-session event, we do have some announcements. First, we wanted to let you know this event is being recorded and will be available for future viewing. You'll receive an email when the replay is available, generally within the next few days. Also, each of today's three sessions will be followed by a 5 to 10 minute Q&A, so please be sure to put your questions into the Q&A area of your console as they come up, so we can get them answered for you by our experts. And during today's third session, we will be giving away a $300 Best Buy gift card, but you must be present to win, so be sure to stay on for the entire event. Finally, we do have resources from our Druva, Recovery Point, and Metallic sponsors available on the console right now, so please download and check those out. Their underwriting this content lets us bring you this summit, so we thank them for supporting the community and ask you to check out those resources so we can bring you more events in the future. Now on to the first session of today's summit. Top Microsoft 365 security threats. This session features Ian Thornton-Trump, CISO at Cyjax. Ian is an ITIL certified IT professional with 25 years of experience in IT and security. After years of service in the Canadian Forces Military Intelligence Branch and the Canadian Forces Military Police Reserves, he retired as a public affairs officer in 2013. After a year with the RCMP as a criminal intelligence analyst, Ian worked as a cybersecurity analyst/consultant for multinational insurance, banking, and regional healthcare verticals. He has deep experience with the threats facing small, medium, and enterprise businesses. His research and experience have made him a sought-after cybersecurity consultant specializing in building security operations, working as a VCISO, and sharing his passion for building effective cyber threat intelligence programs for small, medium, and enterprise organizations. Ian, it's great to have you here. Please take it away.
So great, David, and thank you so much for the kind introduction. Now, folks, this one is going to be a lot of fun. I'm going to throw some really interesting stories, anecdotes, and my own personal observations into this. But one of the things that I really want to talk about and that I think is really important is, first of all, we can't do this without our sponsors like Metallica and Druva and Recovery Point. So please give them a follow on social media as well as on LinkedIn. Now, I do a lot of these, and I'm amongst friends here. So I'm going to talk really about my experiences with this. And as part of this conversation that we had, and I'm laughing already at this because David and I had a little off-screen conversation, I've realized that I've been using the Office suite since Office 97, possibly a little bit earlier, but the only concrete way that I knew that is I was looking at an old spreadsheet, and I saw the actual install code for my Office 97 suite. Now, I just did a quick little Google, and as it turns out, Office 97 to this very day will work fine on Windows 10, which means in terms of the bad guys owning you because they launched some sort of VBA attack, that would work too. So, I'm just saying it's really interesting to me to go all the way back sort of into the deep, deep archives of my experiences and take you on a journey. And this was the best slide I could find to talk about my journey through the Office suite. And I do remember installing the Office suite before CD-ROM drives became a thing. And I remember having to install the entire Office suite on 1.44 megabyte disks before we got to CD-ROM and before like anybody could download, something at speed. So I'm really actually kind of nostalgic as well as delighted to be able to talk through some of my observations and put them into the historical context of all the Office 365 things. Now, when we talk about Office 365 and just sort of like, the Outlook, the Azure, Cloud, OneDrive, we're talking about Word, Excel, PowerPoint, yes, that thing that no one uses. Then you have Skype and Teams and Yammer, which, to be fair, I think Skype and Yammer are eventually going to be sunset and everything will become Teams. And say what you want about Teams, but the experiences that I've had with Teams on the Mac platform has been extraordinarily painful. However, the experience that I've had with Teams on my iPhone has been extraordinarily good, and I don't understand why the two can't work seamlessly the way that it seems to work on the iPhone platform, where I can switch instances between different Office 365 tenants, and that seems to work seamlessly on the iPhone, but it's tons of trouble when you're dealing with Teams and external links found in Teams to different documents. I'm sure you guys out there and gals can feel me on that one, because it can kind of be a bit of a nightmare. Now, the Office 365 suite, as you were, and depending on what licensing level that you have, is I would call it almost integrated very deeply into the browser ecosystem as well as the operating system. And we'll see why. Because Office 365 is one of the small tips of the iceberg in terms of the total offerings that Microsoft has in this space, not to mention some deep dependencies of Office on the operating system's capabilities. I'm talking about things like certificate management, et cetera, but also in the Microsoft suite that also comes with the whole shebang. And by shebang, I mean all of the other pieces of Microsoft's vision of security and configuration and deployment and collecting analytics, and of course, preventing exploitation of your Office infrastructure. So we have this crazy relationship when we talk about Office 365. It's very difficult in a modern enterprise domain to distance ourselves from the Office 365 suite and the operating systems, inevitably different flavors of Windows 10, 11, and I've heard Windows 12 is the absolute bomb, true to the idea that every second Windows operating system since Vista seems to be much better and much stable and more accommodating to the users. So as we can see, under the hood of Office 365 are a bunch of things that Microsoft provides us. And when we deep dive, Microsoft, knowing full well that their operating system is the one that is most likely to be exploited by threat actors and APT actors, and just to suffer from various configuration vulnerabilities, we have the Microsoft Defender for Endpoint, which is intrinsically tied into the operating system, even if you're not part or have not bought the upgrades to turn Microsoft Defender for Endpoint into a full EDR suite. It still exists as Microsoft Defender on each operating system, and the Office platform shares a common security framework with the intrinsic and built-in antivirus capabilities of the operating system. But, as I like to say, and I will say on several occasions, and there's still more things, because Office 365, when you combine it with an email offering, which most organizations do, and it usually incorporates the cloud-hosted Exchange environment that is there, also has the endpoint component built into the operating system, but also an Office 365 called Advanced Persistent Threat Detection module in front of it as well. And as you can see, this is where you have multiple antiviruses looking at the sender email that comes in, a detonation chamber for sandboxing executables, looking at the type of registries calls. Folks, I was doing this in 2015 on virtual machines by snapshotting the registry before I detonated a payload and then snapshotting the registry after I detonated a payload to see what those new keys and or modifications to existing keys were made. Back in the day, to get persistence on a box, you would just simply add an executable that in a silent mode by editing the registry key on the machine itself. So all of these things, of course, are heuristic or unsafe behaviors that would be easily identified from an actual detonation in a sandbox environment, as well as using queries into whether or not the links provided in an email are legit. We see ways of bypassing that by advanced persistent threat actors who will bury the thing, will bury the link inside a .htm file. So it's obfuscated, and then the victim clicks on that HTML file, and then there's some sort of potential payload or a link where they're after your credentials, which is a huge foreshadow about the top 365 security threats, and it's the actual credentials to your Office 365 environment that really are the cause for a lot of concern. And then don't forget the other components that exist out there, like the Microsoft Office Suite for iPad and Outlook for iPhone that a lot of folks are using, even though the native iPhone mail application certainly supports Microsoft's Exchange Online and Outlook offerings. But then a big component of this is the Microsoft Authenticator to get away from SMS to FA, and there's huge debate in the information security community, including this resorting to personal attacks just the way as password length and complexity and password managers have evolved into an extended and very acrimonious debate. But at the end of the day, I think no SMS 2FA is worse than no 2FA, and that an authenticator type of app is probably a level up in terms of security. And I know that might be a bit contentious, because the problem with asking people to install an app on their personal phones, an app like Microsoft Authenticator, which does present your GPS location in order to determine whether or not you're able to access your Office 365 tenant, depending on your geolocation, is some concern in terms of very personal data about your location being transmitted to potentially American servers, and that pulls in Schrems 2 and Safe Harbor and a whole bunch of other nonsense that is outside the scope of this, but is the kind of thing that if we're ever find ourselves face to face, we're going to sit down and we can have an extended talk about that over a beverage or two. Now, in my own explorations of Office 365, I found some really interesting data that I want to share with you that does blow up one of the old rules that we had about encrypting personal data from point to pane. So a couple of points to make here. Office 365 to Office 365. So domain X and domain Y that are both Office 365 do not use external DNS or MX records. And I found this out the hard way because a customer's domain had expired, yet their email was working almost perfectly without the domain actually being in effect and expired. And I thought, okay, well, maybe it's just being cached. However, what we learned very quickly was that the Office worked perfectly, and email to 90% of their clients worked fine, but there were some emails to certain clients that didn't work and got bounced back. Really, really interesting. So what we learned there is that an Office 365 account to an Office 365 account seems to be agnostic to external DNS and MX records. But wait, there was more of a discovery that became really interesting, was that I learned through some friends that work in the infrastructure and Mystic team that Office 365 to Office 365 and Gmail force TLS 1.2. So they're encrypted. Not only are they encrypted tenant to tenant, but they're encrypted tenant to Gmail tenant, which I found really, really interesting. And also that the transport goes data center to data center. So Microsoft to Google, Google to Microsoft, and does not go over the public internet. So I thought that was like really interesting too. So this text in the box here is the stuff that came directly from Microsoft when I started like looking at this, because I wanted to validate these assumptions for you, because you know what happens is that you say something outrageous that people want to dispute and pick a fight, and that's all cool and everything, but I wanted to get you the facts. Now, why this is so disruptive is if you're in a regulated industry where you need to send personal data back and forth between emails, it has to be encrypted. That's really cool, because now, essentially, you don't have to do the stupid things that we all used to do, which was zip it up, email passwords separately, and do all of those kind of things. Now, this is absolutely dependent on whether or not they're a Gmail tenant or an Office 365 tenant, because if you're on-premise, and we will talk about the nightmare of on-premise in a moment, my friends, but this forces the encryption of the data at rest in transit if you're using this environment, which allows us now to send basically personal data back and forth. And so all of the PKI infrastructure, all of that extra stuff that we used to do to, quote, make email secure, has to say it's almost legacy now, folks, because we don't really need this technology anymore to protect our email systems, so long as we know it's an Office 365 tenant to an Office 365 tenant. Cool. So other stuff that happened that I think we really need to talk about. Now, I'm not a Microsoft fanboy, nor am not a ridiculous kind of critic of Microsoft and whatnot. But as you guys probably know, we don't like being lied to as people. And unfortunately, we kind of got lied to during the whole SolarWinds debacle, where Microsoft basically tried to feed us the line that they had a source code compromise and that, that was no big deal. Well, I'm about to dump some stuff on you that is going to be a little bit mind-blowing. I think on the balance of probabilities, I'm going to say it's probably about 95% accurate. I may be missing a few of the details here, but I'm really going to talk and dig deep here on what I see is a bunch of things that unfortunately happened. So later on, Microsoft admitted that there was some source code downloaded for Azure, Exchange, and Intune. Now, there is a huge, important distinction to make about this, okay? And I don't think anyone appreciated the idea that they immediately focused on, well, no customer data was exposed. That may be true, and I think it is true, except it's not true when we talk about the other part to the SolarWinds attack that we're going to dissect. But what happened here is that Azure and Intune have to be put in a different category than Exchange components. Here's why. Azure and Intune are cloud-based systems, and the Exchange components that were compromised were for on-premise Exchange. Now, I said three words that should put fear into the heart of any organization for a lot of reasons. But we're going to get to those in a moment. Azure and Intune, because their cloud services are easily patched, okay? They're easily patched because Microsoft controls all of the infrastructure and all of the code in order to provide those services to you, all right? So you see where I'm coming from. When you're dealing with an on-premise Exchange server, they can issue all the patches that they want, but you've got to install them. You have to manage that. So if there was a compromise in some code for Azure and Intune, Microsoft can just patch it, update their own system, maybe not even telling you about it, but all of a sudden, that's dealt with. As I just read before this webinar, there's a bunch of critical Azure patches that Microsoft made. They didn't really even have to tell us about that. It was more of a behind-the-scenes thing. So this is an important thing to understand, because if you attack a cloud service or you discover a vulnerability with a cloud service, when you patch it as the vendor, it patches all the things pretty much near instantly, okay? When you're dealing with an on-premise where there's multiple licenses for a piece of software that's standalone, the incumbency of the customer to patch becomes really, really important. Now, our story gets a little bit better because, of course, Wired and Kim Zettler, if you follow cybersecurity, you know who Kim Zettler is. She has an amazing book, which is well worth a read. But she basically dropped a bombshell on everyone that basically said the Department of Justice detected the SolarWinds hack 6 months earlier than first disclosed. Well, why is that bad? Well, it means that Russians who were able to get into the DOJ systems, and I'm going to walk us through how that worked as sort of like what the threat to your email is, and why that was such a bad thing. It now indicates that the Russians had time to explore the Department of Justice and U.S. Marshals, by the way, networks for quite some time to look for, I'm just going to call it, goodies. And this could be in the form of like mentions of particular people that the Russians knew were involved in either potential espionage operations or all of the other potential front businesses or any grand jury depositions that hadn't been made. And this is how it worked, okay? So we have the SolarWinds breach that occurred, and Microsoft Office 365, the cloud platform, and those subcomponents of Exchange were compromised, okay? And this generated a real problem because the code that Exchange is based on, SNMP, IMAP, and all of those type of things, right? All of those things have code that goes back a really, really long time, and still built into the product for all of that backwards compatibility, okay? So the issue here is if you have this source code, you can quickly red team it, you can get some talented coders and start building exploits for it. And that's exactly what happened. The exploits kind of culminated in Rackspace having multiple customers, I believe it was in the hundreds of customers, compromised and dropped ransomware on hosted Exchange servers because they weren't patched fast enough. Now, the other part of this story arc here was a compromise of Office 365 by the Russian operatives, who then used the Office 365 tenant to do things like reset passwords to the Department of Justice's PACER system, which is the public access to court records, electronic records. Now, America runs a very open justice system in that when somebody is convicted, sometimes even when they're when they're accused, all of the information about that is stored online in the PACER system. Now, there are documents that are sometimes held back. They either are not going to be disclosed publicly because they may contain sensitive information about other people. like the dastardly people that ratted you out, or grand jury testimony, or all sorts of other potentially incriminating evidence that may not support the current set of charges that the individual is facing, individuals or groups. So why Office 365? Well, several district attorneys had their DOJ email accounts, which was hosted in Office 365, compromised. That way, the bad people were able to take over those accounts and look at privileged information within the PACER system that you or I had, if you had a non-privileged PACER account, which you can get quite easily, would be able to access. And it's quite possible documents could have been stolen, documents could be potentially modified, and things like that. Although there is logging and extensive logging capabilities within the PACER system, but the point is that this Office 365 compromise, because of credentials, allowed an advanced persistent threat actor into a system that is quite sensitive. And that is sort of one of the biggest threats for organizations. Now, for individuals, if you look at the same attack path, only put your cyber criminal mind, okay, into the process here, what you're looking to do is take over someone's email account and, basically all of the nefarious things, access to systems, access to the Amazon accounts, the eBay accounts, sensitive information that you have at work, all of this kind of information can be then exploited by folks, as well as potentially using the set of credentials that have been compromised to gain access via VPN or other online web portals. So protection of Office 365 is probably one of the things that is the biggest call to action within an organization and represents potentially the biggest threat to your organization. Now, this is kind of where we went that was really, really the result of Microsoft's compromise of those, quote, Exchange components. And as this headline read, it looks like there was potentially thousands of customers that were exploited by the Chinese using a similar attack path, but their attack path was focused on on-premise Exchange servers. So not the actual credential hijack per se that was used to exploit the PACER system, but the actual exploitation of vulnerabilities. Now, in some cases, though, after the investigation of this, it was determined that the Chinese used both techniques. The exploitation of a zero-day vulnerability on Exchange servers, but also just simply breaking in with stolen passwords or brute force attacks. Then they were able to create a web shell to control the compromised server remotely, and then use the web shell to exfiltrate information from that organization's on-premise Exchange server, and use that certainly in an espionage capacity, but other organizations used it to drop ransomware into an organization by laterally moving from the compromised Exchange server into the network Active Directory server that was there, which goes back to when I said there's a whole bunch of, I would say, enabling services that Microsoft provides, including Azure AD, which is a cloud-based Active Directory service, which is more immune, I would say, to the traditional ransomware attacks that you would suffer. Be assured, though, if you lose domain or enterprise admin credentials in either relationship, your Azure hosted domain infrastructure or your on-premise infrastructure can both be destroyed. So this is now something that plays into our sponsors' ability to back that up and get that back in an emergency scenario. Now, one of the things that came out of this nation-state attack on on-premise servers was adding a nation-state threat alert to Defender for Office 365. So again, what we're seeing is a dependence on cloud-based and on-premise cybersecurity infrastructure. So that's a really important thing to understand, which complicates immensely any segregated networks where you're limiting access to the internet. You are going to have to write dozens and dozens of different firewall rules to allow the whitelisting of your internal OT network to be able to reach out to specific IP addresses and domains for licensing and functionality of your software. So I think this is an important understanding that, for instance, if you can't update the antivirus system that you've chosen, no matter what it is, on those endpoints, you're not really able to continuously monitor for the latest and greatest type of malware that may infect your environment. So this was the big argument that happened, and many of us in the cybersecurity community went half conspiracy theory, half this is a brilliant plan, and strikes with the evil genius of Microsoft, which we're going to get into a little bit why Microsoft Office 365 especially is a platform for evil genius. But here we have the Chinese threat actors targeting the Exchange servers with all of these zero-day vulnerabilities. Obviously, they're not zero-day now. Patches are available because they all have CVE numbers. But there is a big argument in many circles about the fact that Microsoft would like you very much, please, to move to their Office 365 platform and hosted Exchange rather than continually sell people Exchange servers for two very important reasons. Once you purchased an Exchange server license and the associated CALs, they couldn't make continuous revenue off of you in that mode, okay? However, Office 365, as we know, is a monthly bill that you've got to pay for. So there is a financial incentive for Microsoft to move you off the Exchange server on-premise and into the cloud. And to be fair, the cloud is getting better at accommodating, integrations and workflows. But the point here that I'm trying to make is Microsoft will slow roll the Exchange server patches because, for every minute out there for a customer that gets whacked by a bad guy, it's more incumbent and financially beneficial for them to have you migrate in an emergency capacity to their Outlook 365 platform and Exchange servers. So and hosted Exchange. So keep that in mind here, in that I feel like over time, on-premise Exchange is probably going to get life cycled out. I'd be surprised to see two more on-premise Exchange versions before they just say, forget this. It costs us too much to be re-engineering and building patches in a constant battle with the bad guys. All right, fair enough. Here's another thing about Office 365 is it now changes the paradigm between local storage versus cloud storage. And again, this is something to be said for the evil genius of Microsoft. But hear me out on this. If you go out and you buy a big HP 3PAR infrastructure, that is a finite cost, okay? The platters that you put into it, you buy the platters, and you're good to go. And essentially, if you're properly managing your data, and that's a big hint about the big reveal, if you're properly managing your data and you can keep it within the confines of the infrastructure that you bought, you're all good. And in fact, you're being really effective at utilizing the hardware that you got. Now, the problem with the hardware you got is eventually its capacity will be exceeded because you're expanding your company and growing, and somebody comes along with a big data digital transformation project and fills up all the things. In which case, you have to make that decision about, do we just buy more on-premise storage, right? Or do we look at cloud-based stuff? Okay. So, this comes down to a big thing. And keep in mind that Microsoft is profitable for a reason, okay? So it's poised to probably be, and if not already is, one of the most profitable companies in the world. Like when we look at the data here, there is a way to read this data, okay, that is really, really interesting to me. There's no question. AWS is by far the largest cloud services provider, with, I think, Oracle in the number 2 spot, okay? But let's think about this. On a much smaller portion of the overall market, you have revenue of what Azure has at $23.4 billion, okay, versus $18.4 billion. So that should answer the question about whether or not Azure storage is profitable to Microsoft or not. It absolutely is. And when you combine that storage and you add the Microsoft 365 suite generating $63.36 billion, wow, I think right now that Microsoft stock is really undervalued, because with 50% of the market share going on with Office 365 alone in 2022 and $23.4 billion in Q1 of 2022, oh my God, it's the only thing that I'm left with in trying to understand all of this. And we're going to get a little bit into the evil genius of Microsoft at some point too in this webinar, because it's truly astounding. Now, this is a couple of things that I want to run by you guys. Now, one of the things that is making Microsoft so profitable is the amount of Azure data that is being consumed by SharePoint Online, which is all part of the Microsoft 365 infrastructure, as well as OneDrive, okay? And OneDrive and SharePoint are completely integrated at this point, right? That's the other thing that you have to understand. Now, Microsoft has been very helpful, because what they've done is they've included some sort of fail-safes. Now, they recognize that, the old undelete that we used to have, capabilities of going into a hard drive, we even had third-party apps that we could use to put files back together that a user had deleted and stuff like that. They realized that in the cloud world, you absolutely, once it's gone, okay? And so we had to build in some of these fail-safes. But they also realized, and this is the evil genius, that they can make a tremendous amount of money. Now, when we talk about security threats, one of the security threats is to your budget, okay? So we have to keep that in mind. Now, here's the thing. There are a couple of really interesting things to talk about here. So first of all, SharePoint Online, when you have a document in SharePoint, so say you have a sales presentation, it's got a short video in it, and it's just for argument's sake, it's 25 megs in size, which is a pretty big presentation, but not, completely outrageous if it's got some really swoopy stuff that your marketing department's put together and graphic design and stuff like that. So not completely unreasonable here. And if it's brochureware and it's high resolution, also not completely unreasonable. Now, if you send that PowerPoint presentation to someone and you put it into an email. Now, keep in mind, you can either send it to them using OneDrive, right, and send them a link to it, okay, or you can download it and attach it. Either way, don't care. But when you send it to the second person, what happens is it duplicates that 25 megabyte file, and it keeps a version history for it. So you've got the actual first file, and then you've got the version history of where you changed it, and now it's created a 25 gigabyte file or 25 megabyte file that you've renamed Killer Sales Presentation for your second customer.com or whatever. It's now kept a copy of that and a version history of that as well. Okay, so what's happened is in a short space of time, a 25 megabit PowerPoint presentation has become a 50 megabit PowerPoint presentation. When copied, it becomes another 25, right? Copied with some minor amendments that you put there. It's become another 25 megabyte PowerPoint presentation with a 25 megabyte shadow copy. Okay, so then you said, wow, we're sure using a lot of OneDrive. Our Azure costs are out of control. And I know one enterprise organization that we're spending over $250,000 on SharePoint document storage on OneDrive alone, okay? Mental. Now, here's the thing. You might say, okay, everyone has got to, if you don't need this particular data, you got to go in and delete it. It's not gone. It's simply not visible anymore, but it's still there, including all the version histories, okay? So this is a huge, huge problem and a huge security threat to your budget, because if you multiply this by 100 people, 1,000 people doing their work, 5,000 people, you are generating a massive amount of data. And even when you thought you deleted it, it's not deleted because there is a data retention policy in effect. So in actual ways to reduce your Azure cloud for storage from getting completely out of control, you have to do the following. You have to go in and temporarily disable the data retention period. You then have to have people delete stuff in their system, okay? And then you can go back in and reactivate the data retention period. Now, why is this important? Because there are some documents that you need to have that 7-year data retention period. And one of the things that Microsoft Office 365 specifically, okay, does is that if you delete a person from AD and Microsoft 365 Admin Center, that user ID is gone and the email is gone unless you're paying Microsoft for archiving capability. Now, why does this become really important? Well, if you've had a salesperson that has said a whole bunch of things in conversations and email to a customer, and a year or two from now, that customer decides that you're not living up to the end of the bargain that the salesperson said, and they decide to go to litigation, you have nothing. You don't have the email boxes for that user ID that has been removed. And keep in mind that every user ID in Azure is going to cost you money, along with the license for the Office 365 suite that's attached to it. So you got to figure out a way to keep this thing under control, because even all of that stagnant data that IT professionals have been doing their whole life, which is, oh, we're just going to copy the shared drive over. Okay, well, you're now copying a bunch of dead data that nobody needs, and Microsoft's going to send you a bill for that every single month. Crazy. And don't forget, even though the document has might even be dated 2003, because you copied it from a server shared drive into the cloud, its modified date has changed. And that means that even though it might be way more than that 7-year-old, it's still going to be there and it's going to be live data. And if you delete it, it doesn't go away. It still stays there. So they gotcha. So you really, really have to be careful about that. Otherwise, the threat to your security bottom line will be bad. Now, want to talk a little bit about Mint Sandstorm. Okay, Mint Sandstorm is, I believe they were an Iranian threat actor. They did some really interesting multi-stage stuff. So what the first thing they did was that they sent a phishing email containing a OneDrive link hosting a PDF. Okay, we get those in enterprise probably on a daily basis. Okay, now this is where that detonation sandbox thing really has to happen, and the stealthy malware actually contained, the PDF contained a macro-enabled template file, okay, on Dropbox, okay? So you open up the OneDrive PDF, but that OneDrive PDF opens up and then reaches out to Dropbox to pull down the macro and execute it, which allows a second stage payload called from OneDrive at all. So what we're talking about here is a document that basically is reaching out to Dropbox, okay? This is why we have to be very careful about our security policies and not allow Dropbox if it's not corporately approved for use, right? Also, you may question whether or not you have a security solution properly inspecting OneDrive links. Now, the way this bypassed a lot of the AV is because all of this was obfuscated and all of it was encrypted as well, which made it really difficult for your endpoint AV to even understand what was going on, right? And then look at this. In order to get the actual malware onto the machine, we're talking about a third stage payload from OneDrive. And then all of that together gave you a whole bunch of compromise on the endpoint. This is the type of attack that we're dealing with to bypass all of the different ways that we've tried to secure that endpoint from compromise. And look, Microsoft understood that this was what the bad guys are doing, and so they changed the default behavior of Office applications to block macros in files. Well, thank God they did, because this has been owning people back since, Office 97, just without the obfuscation and without potentially reaching out to Dropbox, right? Now, the other thing, too, is that the Office 365 suite and all of your control of that, right, really comes down to the fact that you can do a number of things with the security policies in your domain in order to mitigate this type of attack surface, especially if your other security capabilities are not implemented or not capable of stopping this type of attack. And simply put, to make it very apparent in terms of the security threats and your understanding of them, compromised email equals criminal profit for a variety of different things. But we can see two fairly recent indictments for big money that led right back to credential compromise that led to lateral movement and one phishing email that got through that netted the bad guy $23 million in profit. Email by far and away remains the number one attack surface in your organization, and it is under threat from phishing attacks, but it's also under threat from credential stealing attacks. Now, how do we win? As we wrap this up here and we get a question through the Q&A, and it looks like this is a very engaged group, so I thank you for that. I'm just going to go quickly through how do we win. First of all, admit you don't know what you're doing. Pass at least 2 of these exams and consider the other exams to understand the differences in Office 365 when it comes to if you're an Exchange guru, if you're an on-premise Active Directory person. It's time to update those skills. I can't stress this enough, because most of the problems that you're going to face with the security of your Office 365 environment are going to be because of a lack of knowledge and a lack of understanding. It is a complex ecosystem. And even myself, I can sit here and do these webinars, but man, I need experts on my team to truly figure out how to do this. Look at multi-factor authentication and geo-IP restrictions. They absolutely should be in place. Awareness training and security communications. What are the latest attacks that your organization is faced with? Communicate to people to be on the lookout for phishing scams or business email compromise type of scams. Role-based access controls are critical within the Office 365 environment. Everyone should not have or hold the ability to manage the Office 365 environment. That should be a closely managed and monitored system under the authority of the IT department, right? Review and configure Microsoft Office Defender. There are hardening settings, including attack surface reduction that you can put there. Disable auto forwards. This is a big one. Don't let the bad guys get into your system and be able to auto-forward all of the email coming in to a tenant. Disable that and only enable it upon request through your change management process. And back up your Office 365 data to a third party that has no credentials, and I mean no credentials in common with any of your AD managed credentials. Otherwise, heartbreak can ensue. And also included in the Microsoft suite is the Microsoft Secure Score. Give it a look. Think about it as part of your go-to strategy to keep your system safe, especially the Office 365 and Azure AD environment. And with that, All I say to you is bring it on. I'll do my best to get through the Q&A.
Okay, great job, Ian. We do have several questions in the Q&A console. So let's just dig right in. Let's just go first come, first serve. The first question is not a question. First question is an observation from Phil. So you can comment on the observation from Phil, which reads, the answer for Teams on a Mac desktop is the M1 chip. The problem is that the old Intel Macs don't have the GPU capabilities of Windows. M1 or M2 solve that.
Sweet. Phil, send me one. I'd love a new sexy Mac.
Okay.
But that's an interesting note from Phil, and I do thank him for that, because certainly that will be something I'm going to consider, because the level of frustration I've had doing 4 different Office 365 tenants at one time was maddening. Are you there, David?
Okay, it looks like we have about 4 minutes left for the Q&A, and the next question comes from Jay. Jay asked, how capable is Defender given Teams stores auth tokens in clear text?
This is a huge issue, and it relates to a number of sort of exploits of the Microsoft ecosystem. I think the best way to look at this is through the lens of detecting potential compromise. Now, I absolutely agree it should be secure by design. It's clearly not, as any red teamer knows, with the ability to manipulate administrative templates. You can go from like initial penetration right on up to domain enterprise control. But these are sort of the weaknesses that I think that Microsoft has. But again, what we're talking about is if they're already inside your organization, it's like it's going to be a bad day anyways, right? So I feel like that's where you get your Azure Sentinel capabilities involved, where you're sucking up telemetry to detect the stupid and hopefully mitigate the stupid before you're dealing with a full-on incident.
Okay, looks like we have time for one more question. And this comes from Lynn. Lynn asks, do you have any advice about handling compliance requirements during backup and recovery? Organizations need to comply with various regulations such as GDPR and HIPAA, which require them to protect personal data and ensure that it is not misused.
100%. Now, this has always been the issue, and I remember back in the day of GDPR, we were all thinking about, do we have to go in and delete all of that customer data that was that was backed up? The answer to that is no. It's not a requirement. You don't have an issue. Fundamentally, you have to protect that data. So the onus on you, if you're going to a third party, right, is to ask them what their security is, get the statements, make that vendor answer, the questions around, are you compliant? Where is the data located? Is it being transferred, to a different country? And all of those good questions to make sure that your compliance people are happy with it. Most of the time, that will suffice the organization. When you go through the audit process, they may point out and they want more stringent reporting, but they also, at the very same time, need you to be able to prove that backups are occurring. You can't just go through and say, hey, we don't have any backups, that's the way we roll, and YOLO that. That's a terrible idea too. So it's a balance between the two. And what I would suggest is that if you're going to back up databases and back up personal data as it's defined, make sure that you're working with your backup provider to provide that assurance that they're compliant and that they're going to take that responsibility for security as seriously as your organization has to.
Okay, great. Well, it looks like that's all the questions we have time for. So thanks again, Ian, for a great presentation and answering those questions.
Oh, you're welcome. It's my pleasure.
Okay, everyone else, stay tuned. We're going to take a short break and be back at the top of the hour for our second session of the day, Best Practices for Microsoft 365 Security and Recovery. So take this chance to check out those resources on your console provided by Druva, Recovery Point, and Metallic, and we'll be right back.
Welcome back, everyone. John, please take it away.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the second session of the Microsoft 365 Security and Recovery Summit, organized by the hardworking folks at Redmond Magazine, who have brought together some of the best independent experts on today's topic. Many thanks to our sponsors, Druva, the industry's leading SaaS platform and data provider of data resiliency, and Recovery Point, data protection and business resiliency solutions provider, and Metallic, a Commvault venture, provider of enterprise-grade backup solutions for making this event possible. Thanks to you for joining us. I'm John K. Waters, Editor-in-Chief of the Converge 360 Group of 1105 Media, and I'll be your moderator for the second of our 3 information-packed sessions. But before we get started, a quick reminder that each of today's sessions is being recorded for later access. Keep an eye out for an email with a link to that recording. It'll be coming your way within the next few days. Each of today's sessions will be followed by a 5 to 10 minute Q&A. You can type your questions into the Q&A box at any time. Please feel free to add your questions as they occur to you. Throughout the summit, we'll do our best to get to all of them. Our sponsor has provided some extra resources that can be found on the right-hand side of your screen. Please take a moment to check those out. At the end of this summit, you'll be asked to take a very short survey. Please take a moment to share your honest opinions. Our editors actually read every comment. I'm one of them, so I know it's true. Your opinions help to shape our future events. And last but not least, at the end of the third session, one lucky attendee will be receiving a $300 Best Buy gift card. We've just gone straight to the cash, but you must be present to win, so stick with us. Now let's get started with our second session, Best Practices for Microsoft 365 and Security and Recovery. This session we've called on scientist, author, and 21-time Microsoft MVP Brian Posey. Brian has written thousands of articles about information technology and contributed to dozens of books and video training courses on a huge variety of IT topics. Among other professional roles, he's served as the lead network engineer for the United States Department of Defense at Fort Knox and the head of the Technology and Engineering Group of the Association of Space Flight Professionals. He writes the popular Posey's Tips and Tricks column for Redmond Magazine, as well as a must-read Posey's Moonshot column, through which he shares his commercial astronaut training experiences. You guys are in for a great session. Take it away, Brian.
Hey, thank you so much, John, and hello, greetings, and welcome, everyone. And yeah, that headshot picture on the slide, that's brand new. That was just taken within the last week or two. That suit is a prototype that they're using for the return to the moon. So I got to use that suit on a mock-up of the lunar surface in a gravity offset system that made me feel like I weighed the same as what I would on the moon. So if you've ever seen the video of the Apollo astronauts bouncing around on the lunar surface, that's what I got to do while I was testing that suit. It was more fun than you can possibly imagine. At any rate, let's go ahead and get started. So when it comes to Microsoft 365 Security and Recovery, I don't think we can really talk about the topic without first delving into the shared responsibility model. Now, the shared responsibility model is one of those things that I'm guessing at this point most people are probably familiar with. The basic idea is that Microsoft, as well as pretty much every other SaaS provider that I can think of, takes the mentality that they share the responsibility for the integrity of that platform with their customers. Meaning, in the case of Microsoft, that Microsoft is responsible for the underlying platform. They make sure that the servers stay up and that there are no security breaches at the infrastructure level, but that the customer is responsible for their own data that's stored within that SaaS cloud. So this is one of those things that you can read all about on the Microsoft site, but I've never seen it broken down quite as well as in this chart. Now, admittedly, this particular chart came from a vendor, but it still does a really good job of breaking down the shared responsibility model, so I wanted to go ahead and include it anyway. So as you can see, we have the Microsoft responsibility in blue, your responsibility in gray, and I'm not going to go through every single data point on the slide because there's a lot there, but it is something that I would recommend going back and taking a look at a little bit later on if you're not super familiar with the shared responsibility model. The important thing to know is that your responsibility basically boils down to two things. One, making sure that you've got a backup of your own data so that way if you have a data loss event, you've got a way of getting your data back. And two, keeping your data secure. Because generally what we find with Microsoft 365 is that the platform itself is super secure. The attackers out there probably aren't spending a whole lot of time and effort trying to attack Microsoft. Yes, there are attacks on the Microsoft servers every single day, but they're not generally successful because Microsoft has invested tremendous resources into keeping their cloud safe. So what the attackers tend to do instead is to attack the users. They will trick them into launching malware that will give them backdoor access into their portal in the Microsoft 365 cloud and other similar measures. So Microsoft stresses that it's extremely important to keep your own data secure to prevent that sort of thing and to make sure that you've got a way of getting your data back if bad things happen. So that's just a really quick take on the shared responsibility model. So what lessons can we learn from this? Well, point number one is that Microsoft doesn't back up your data. That's up to you. Now, you'll notice on this slide that in parentheses we have except for their own purposes, or except for its own purposes, I think the slide says. And there are rumors, unconfirmed albeit, that Microsoft actually does perform backups of their customers' data, but they do it for their own internal purposes. The idea being that if something horribly catastrophic were to happen and Microsoft had to restore its entire Office 365 cloud from scratch, they want to put things back as close to normal as they can possibly get them, and that includes customer data. But having said that, even if these internal backups of customer data exist, it's not the sort of thing where you can call Microsoft and say, hey, I lost a file, can you restore it? That falls outside of their portion of the shared responsibility model, and that's just not something that they're going to do, except with one possible SharePoint-related exception that I'll mention a little bit later on. So the next lesson to be learned. The native Microsoft 365 data recovery mechanisms exist as a convenience, but they're not a substitute for backups. Now, what do I mean by this? Well, Microsoft 365 includes several different mechanisms that you can use to get your data back if a file happens to be accidentally deleted. And there are several of these. Now, I've got a lot that I want to cover in this presentation, so I don't want to go into this in super in depth. And I'm not necessarily going to talk about every recovery mechanism, but I do want to mention a few of them just for the sake of putting that information out there. We'll start with Teams. Now, when it comes to Teams recovery, you have to consider what's going on behind the scenes. When you create a new team, what's happening behind the scenes is that Azure Active Directory is actually creating a group that corresponds to that team. When you delete a team, Azure Active Directory deletes that group that corresponds to the team. So there's a one-to-one relationship between a Microsoft 365 team and a group that corresponds to that team. So having said that, let's suppose somebody accidentally deletes a team. Well, the trick to getting that team back is to open up PowerShell, connect to Azure Active Directory, and undelete that corresponding group, and that will bring back the team. Now, keeping in mind that doesn't give you granular recovery capabilities within Teams, but it will give you a way of bringing back that team, at least for a period of time, until that deleted group eventually expires. So what else can you do? Well, if a user deletes a file from OneDrive, there's a OneDrive recycle bin that you can use to get that item back. Now, the retention period for deleted items within OneDrive really varies depending on the type of subscription that you're using. If your users are just using a Microsoft account, then that retention period is 30 days. That's it. You've got 1 month to get that data back. But if, on the other hand, users are using Microsoft 365, which is, of course, what we're talking about today, then that retention period is 93 days. So 93 days from the time when an object in OneDrive is deleted, that's how long you have to realize it's gone and get it back from that recycle bin before it's gone forever. There is a similar mechanism within SharePoint called the SharePoint recycle bin. And like OneDrive, there's a 93-day retention period. Now, if you think back to just a few minutes ago when I was talking about Microsoft doesn't allow you to just call up their support and request that they restore a backup, I mentioned that there was one notable exception, and that was for SharePoint. And here's where that exception comes into play. Let's suppose for a minute that you lose something really, really, really important in SharePoint, and for whatever reason there's no backup of it, and you've gone past that 93-day retention period for recovering that item from the SharePoint recycle bin. There is one other option. You have another 14 days after that 93-day period in which you can call Microsoft support and tell them about your problem and have them to perform a recovery. Now, having said that, there are some very significant restrictions associated with this recovery process. And what that restriction is that when Microsoft performs this recovery, they will recover an entire site collection, but they won't recover individual files. So think about that for a moment. If you request Microsoft to perform this recovery, they're going to restore the entire site collection, meaning that anything that has accumulated in the time since that item was deleted, namely 93 plus days worth of data, is all going to be overwritten. So this isn't the sort of thing that you want to do unless you really have no other choice. It's an absolute last resort option. And then one more item that I'll mention, which I've already kind of danced around a little bit, is the Azure Active Directory Recycle Bin. And I talked about this a little bit with regard to Teams recovery. As you'll recall, I mentioned that when you delete a team, what you're really doing is deleting a Azure Active Directory group that's connected to that team. And when you delete that group goes into the Azure Active Directory Recycle Bin. And items in the Azure Active Directory Recycle Bin are by default retained for 30 days. So you've got 30 days to recover items from the Azure Active Directory Recycle Bin. So all of that is to say that Microsoft does provide you with some ways of getting your data back should that data become accidentally deleted. But all of those methods that I just discussed and a few others exist primarily for convenience purposes. They're in no way meant to act as a backup substitute. You really don't want to avoid creating backups and just say, oh, well, if I happen to lose data, then I've always got this recycle bin I can get the data back from. You have to have a backup. Now, another point that I'll make is that creating a backup is great. Certainly any backup that you make is going to be better than not having a backup at all. That's kind of a given. But having said that, there's a huge difference between just creating a one-off backup and doing backup well. So that's where this webcast comes into play. I want to talk about some best practices for creating backups within a Microsoft 365 environment, so that way you can make sure that you're achieving the desired level of protection. Now, obviously, time constraints being what they are, there's no way I can possibly cover every single best practice associated with Microsoft 365 backups, but I do want to touch on some of the more important ones. Now, throughout this conversation, I'm going to be talking about some important considerations that you need to take into account with regard to the backup software that you're using. And these considerations, or at least most of them, also apply to using backup as a service. Having said that, it's worth noting that I'm not doing this as a way of endorsing any particular product or any particular vendor or service or anything like that. My only purpose here is to simply talk about some of the things that you need to be considering with regard to your Microsoft 365 backups. So let's get into some best practices. The very first best practice that I want to mention is to make sure that your software is designed for Microsoft 365. Now, on the surface, this best practice sounds absolutely ridiculous because pretty much any backup application that you're going to use is going to be able to back up your Microsoft 365 data. But the key here is that it needs to be able to interact with the Microsoft 365 environment at the API level. That's the important part. So what does this mean and why is it so important? Well, for anybody out there who might not be familiar with the term, API stands for Application Programming Interface. It's essentially a tool that Microsoft makes available to the backup vendors so that they can interact with the Microsoft 365 environment in the way that Microsoft specifies. And the reason why this is so important is because it allows for application-level backups. So let's suppose that you've got some really, really old backup application, maybe something that completely predates Microsoft 365, as unbelievable as such a thing would be. But let's pretend that that was the case. And you've somehow managed to connect to Microsoft 365 and perform a backup. What you would probably end up with in a situation like that is a backup of all of the various files that exist in the Microsoft 365 cloud. And really, in this situation, even that might be a stretch, but let's just pretend for a moment that that's what you would get. So you would be able to restore files and folders in that case. Where the API comes into play is that it allows you to perform application-level backups. So in the case of SharePoint, for example, if you're solely performing a file-level backup, you might be able to back up the contents of some of your libraries. Maybe you could back up some lists or things like that. But if you've got a Microsoft 365 aware backup, then what that's going to do for you is it's going to allow you to perform those granular restorations of files and lists and libraries and that sort of thing. But you'll also be able to restore things like sites and site collections. So having that application-aware backup gives you options. That's the important part. Now, as I mentioned, pretty much every backup application out there today is Microsoft 365 aware. They are using Microsoft's API. The reason why I wanted to mention this, though, is because not only is it important to make sure that your backup application is Microsoft 365 aware, it's also important to make sure that it's current. Now, when I say current, I'm not talking about installing the latest security patches for your backup application, although if you are running your own backup application, that is an important thing to do. What I'm really talking about with regard to it being current is making sure that it uses the latest API from Microsoft. So why is this so important? Well, if you really stop and think about it, Microsoft 365 is a highly dynamic application. In other words, Microsoft is constantly making changes to it. They add new features and capabilities on a regular basis. Sometimes they might even introduce a new application. And because Microsoft 365 is always changing, every once in a while Microsoft will release a new API to the backup vendors so that the backups can take advantage of some of those new features and capabilities. Now, from what I've been told, the releases of backup APIs don't happen super frequently, but they do happen. And there was a situation a few years ago, and I'm by no means trying to call out any particular backup vendor or anything like that, but Microsoft released a new backup API when Teams first started gaining mainstream popularity. And the reason why they did that is because the previous backup API didn't have direct support for Teams. Now, as previously noted, recovering a team from the Azure AD recycle bin really isn't a big deal. You're basically just restoring a group, and all of the backup applications at that point have that ability. But when you do this type of recovery, it's an all-or-nothing situation. So in other words, if a user accidentally deletes a team, no problem. You restore that group, you're back in business. If a user deletes a file within a team, however, or an application within a team or something like that, well, that's a completely different story because just restoring a group isn't going to get you that file back without restoring the entire team. So that's the problem that we had with regard to backup vendors not using the latest API that supported Teams. Now, eventually, everybody kind of caught up, and as far as I know, most of the backup vendors now do support the latest API that includes Teams support. But the reason why I wanted to mention that is just to stress the importance of making sure that whatever backup solution you're using, that it is tied to the latest Microsoft backup API so that you're getting the best possible support for backing up and protecting your Microsoft 365 environment. So let's move on to another let's move on to another best practice. And that best practice is to make sure that whatever backup application you're using supports hybrid Office deployments and hybrid Active Directory. Now, on the surface, this might seem like one of those things that's kind of a niche case and that the recommendation doesn't necessarily apply to everybody. And yes, there are some organizations for which this recommendation doesn't matter. But there are several reasons why having hybrid support does matter, why it's so important. Now, before I really get into this, what do I mean by hybrid? Well, in most cases, when people talk about hybrid Microsoft 365 environments, what they're really referring to is deployments in which there are Office servers that are running on premises, and the organization is also using the Microsoft 365 cloud. So that's what people generally mean when they talk about hybrid Microsoft 365. So why does a backup application have to have hybrid support? Well, there are a few different reasons. One is that if you do have a hybrid environment like what I just described, you want to be able to back up everything in a consistent manner. You want to use one backup application and one backup job to back up your on-premises Microsoft Office servers and those resources within the Microsoft 365 cloud. You shouldn't have to use one backup application for one environment and a separate backup application for the other, or separate jobs for one environment and the other environment, or anything like that. You want to have that consistency so that you can back everything up together and make your life as easy as possible. Now, there are other reasons for hybrid support beyond just convenience. Another reason is because of the role that Active Directory plays in all of this. when it comes to on-premises Microsoft Office servers, things like Exchange Server and SharePoint Server and things like that, those servers have a direct dependency on your Active Directory. Now, by the same token, the services that exist in the Microsoft 365 Cloud also have an Active Directory dependency, but they use Azure Active Directory. So Exchange Online has a direct dependency on Azure Active Directory. SharePoint Online depends on Azure Active Directory, and so on and so forth. So even if an organization isn't running any on-premises Microsoft 365 servers, they may have an on-premises Active Directory environment that's being synchronized up to Microsoft 365 by way of Azure AD Connect. So if you've got an on-premises Active Directory environment that's being synchronized with Microsoft 365, then technically you've got a hybrid environment, even if you're not running any Office servers on premises. So you want to make sure that you're backing up that environment in a consistent manner, because otherwise you could end up with synchronization issues between the resources in Azure Active Directory and the on-premises Active Directory resources. You never want to end up with those consistency issues. You want to make sure that everything's backed up in a very consistent way. And then, of course, there's also the issue of data portability, because being able to back up your on-premises environment and your Microsoft 365 environment all at the same time gives you the option of moving data around on an as-needed basis. So this can be helpful if you're performing a migration, but it can also help out with unplanned migrations. So just for example, let's suppose that you've got an on-premises Exchange server, and something happened, you had a massive outage, and all of a sudden all of the users who were using that on-premises Exchange server are down. They can't access their email, and in looking at the problem, it's not the sort of thing that you're going to be able to fix quickly. Well, in a situation like that, what you might be able to do is to use your backup to restore all of those mailboxes up to Microsoft 365. Then you point all of the user accounts to the new mailbox location. And then those users can get back to work while you're working on fixing the problem. Now, just because you migrated those mailboxes up to the Microsoft 365 Cloud, it doesn't necessarily mean that you have to leave those mailboxes there, although you can. You can use that as a temporary location, allowing those users to do their jobs. And then once you've got the problem fixed on site, then you can bring those mailboxes back down to where they need to be. Now, of course, there may be compliance issues that come into play that would prevent you from doing something like that. But when we're talking about backup and recovery in a hypothetical and general sense, data portability is one of the big benefits that you gain by backing up on-premises environments and Microsoft 365 environments with a common backup application that can handle both environments. So another best practice is to make sure that you choose your backup location carefully. Now, this one is kind of a sticky subject with some people, but the idea being that when you back up your Microsoft 365 environment, you have to put that backup somewhere. So where are you going to put it? Well, at a bare minimum, you want to make sure that you put that backup somewhere outside of the Microsoft 365 Cloud, because let's say for a moment that whatever backup tool you're using, it creates a backup file, and you store that backup file in OneDrive. Well, if something happens to your Microsoft 365 environment, there goes OneDrive, and there goes your backup and your ability to recover. So you don't want to put yourself in a situation like that. So make sure that you're storing your backups somewhere outside of Microsoft 365. Now, there are also quite a few other things that you need to consider with regard to backup location. One of the things that you'll have to consider is the time required to restore from various locations. Because any place that you put your backup, whether it's an on-premises repository or you're storing it in a public cloud somewhere, anywhere that you're storing that backup, it's going to have certain performance characteristics. The storage is going to run at a certain speed. You're going to have a certain amount of bandwidth available. So you have to consider the amount of time that it's going to take to restore from a given location and factor that into your decision about where to store the backup. Another thing to consider is storage cost. Again, whether you're storing on premises or you're storing in a public cloud, there's going to be a certain cost associated with storing those backups. So you want to make sure that you're not storing those backups in a place that's going to cause problems for your IT budget. If you're storing to the public cloud, you also have to be thinking about data egress fees. Data egress fees, for anybody who might not be familiar with the term, is the idea that a lot of the larger hyperscaler public cloud providers charge a fee anytime data leaves their cloud. And they do this as a way of discouraging customers from migrating their data to a competing cloud. But the problem with the data egress fees is that they can also come into play whenever you're restoring a backup, assuming that that restoration is restoring data to something outside of the cloud, such as Microsoft 365 in this case. So you want to make sure that if you're ever put in a situation where you're restoring massive amounts of data, that you either avoid data egress fees or you're at least aware of what those data egress fees will be and you're okay with that. Another major consideration is, of course, security. You don't want your backup put somewhere where it's going to be easily compromised. And, of course, reliability. Whatever platform you store your backups on, it has to be reliable. It has to be there when you need it. And it has to be able to handle whatever tasks you throw at it. Now, I mentioned a few minutes ago that choosing a backup storage location can be a sticky subject in some circles. And the reason why I say this is because, and I'm trying to be delicate here, but in at least some IT circles, there seems to be a mindset of cloud good, on-premises bad. I've heard people say with regard to Microsoft 365, hey, you put your data in the cloud for a reason, so that data should never, ever, ever come back on premises, as though on-premises storage is somehow an evil thing. I'm more of the mindset that there is a time and a place for everything, and that the cloud is neither good nor evil. On-premises is neither good nor evil. Instead, you have to consider things like logistics and the business advantage or disadvantage of using a particular location. So I'm not saying that you should never bring backup data on premises or that you should always use the cloud or never use the cloud or anything like that. What I am saying is that it's important to consider your backup location from a business standpoint and make the decision that makes the most sense for your organization, regardless of what others might end up telling you. So in my mind, the best way to store your backups is to make sure that you've got some level of redundancy in place. My recommendation would be to store a copy in the cloud, and if you've got the infrastructure on hand, and that's a big if, but if you do have the available infrastructure, store a copy on premises. You probably don't want to store your primary backup on premises simply because of the amount of time that it would take to do a full-blown recovery should the need ever arise. But if you've got the space on premises, it's probably a good idea to retain a copy of your backup there, just so you've got a backup that's in your direct control. But whatever platform you choose for storing your backups, whether it be Amazon S3 or Azure Files or an on-premises file server or whatever, the important thing is make sure that your backup application supports that form of storage. So another best practice, and this is something that I've already touched on a few times throughout this presentation, is don't forget about the need for granular recovery. I talked about this with regard to teams, about that there's a big difference between restoring an entire team and restoring a file or an application within a team. So make sure that you can restore your Microsoft 365 data at whatever level of granularity you need. That you're not locked into a situation where you have to do an all-or-nothing recovery. And as crazy as it sounds, there are older backup applications that will still lock you into this model. This is more true with like really old, low-cost or free backup applications, but such applications do exist. How insidious can this get? Well, let me tell you about a situation from way, way, way back when. This really isn't all that relevant to today, but it kind of paints a picture about what an all-or-nothing recovery looks like. Back in the days of, I believe it was Exchange 5, there was no Microsoft-supported method for restoring an individual mailbox or restoring a message within a mailbox. So at the time, I was working with the military, and one of the upper brass ended up deleting an important message. And because they were using a non-standard client in place of Outlook, that message, when they deleted it, didn't go to the deleted items folder. It was just gone. And this was something that they needed, and this was a very high-ranking individual. And they just said, I don't want this message back, period. It was up to us to figure out how to make it happen. And as I mentioned, at that time, Microsoft didn't support doing granular recovery and exchange. Likewise, none of the backup vendors really supported any kind of granular recovery. And it fell on us to get that message back. So here's what we had to do. We had to set up a lab environment. So we had to procure some servers, and we had to put in place a Windows domain, and then we had to restore a backup of our Exchange environment, and then set up an Outlook client, go in, change the password on that particular user's account in the lab environment so that we could log into it, attach Outlook, go in, find that one message, and then save that message to a PST file, and then give that message to that user. So we're talking about dozens of hours worth of work to retrieve one email message from backup. Now, again, by today's standards, that's ridiculous. You would never see a situation like that. But the point being that this whole thing could have been avoided if we had a way of doing granular recovery. So the backup applications that are out there today, most of them do support granular recovery, but not every level of recovery is necessarily supported by every single backup application. So you want to make sure that your backup application is as flexible as it can possibly be, that it allows you to restore data at all different levels. So if we're talking about Exchange, you need to be able to restore at the mailbox level, at the Exchange server level, at the mailbox store level, individual messages, and what have you. And the same applies for the other Microsoft 365 applications. You don't want to get locked into a situation where you have to make a decision about doing an all-or-nothing recovery, or when you only have a few recovery options that are made available to you. So another best practice is to make sure that whatever backup application you're using has some e-discovery capabilities that are built into it. Now, e-discovery is largely considered to be a compliance-based feature, although I have seen some people use the native Microsoft 365 e-discovery capabilities as a data protection mechanism. The idea being that you can turn on litigation hold. I think that's what Microsoft's calling it right now. And all that data will be preserved. So if you end up having a data loss event, all you have to do is go into a litigation hold and retrieve that particular item that was lost, and you can get it back from there. Now, that's not a perfect solution by any stretch of the imagination, because if you're recovering a big volume of data, using litigation hold can be really cumbersome for getting that data back. And litigation hold also counts against your Microsoft 365 storage quota. So you probably don't want to be using that as your primary data protection mechanism, although it does have its place. The reason why I listed e-discovery capabilities on this particular slide is because there are backup applications out there that have their own e-discovery built in. And even if you're not necessarily interested in doing e-discovery per se, having those advanced search capabilities can make it really easy to figure out where a particular item is that needs to be recovered, or if that particular item has been backed up and when and which versions are available. It can just kind of simplify the whole thing, having that access to that sort of data. Another thing to consider with regard to Microsoft 365 backups is ease of use. Now again, in the grand scheme of things, ease of use would seem unimportant. But I tend to think of it as a relatively important factor for your consideration, simply because if you've got a backup application that's overly complex, then that unnecessary complexity is probably going to lead to some administrative mistakes. You may have a situation where an administrator sets up a backup job wrong simply because the backup application was overcomplicated, or you could end up in a situation where it's a lot more time-consuming and a lot more cumbersome to figure out how to restore the data you need simply because the environment is a lot more complicated than what it really needs to be. Because remember, when a disaster occurs, your goal is to recover the data as quickly as possible. And so that isn't the time to be figuring out how the backup application works. So it's important to find something that's easy to use and to also do those rehearsals. Try practicing restoring data at various levels of granularity and just make sure that you know how to do it so that way when a real data loss event does occur, you're ready for it. You know how to get that data back, and you know which recovery option is going to be the best suited for that particular situation. So let's talk a little bit about security. Security is obviously an important consideration anytime that we're talking about data. especially Microsoft 365. But sometimes you need a little bit more than basic security. So what are we talking about when it comes to security with backups for Microsoft 365? Well, some of the more commonly used security features include things like storage encryption, immutable storage, multi-factor authentication, and the list goes on and on. Now, with regard to immutable storage, that's one of those things that's become immensely popular lately simply because of the fight against ransomware. The idea being that ransomware authors know that you're never, ever going to pay a ransom if you can simply get your data back by restoring a backup instead. So with that mindset in mind, ransomware authors have increasingly turned to trying to take out backups. So there are a lot of ransomware variants out there that are specifically designed to seek out your backup, target that backup, and render the backup unfunctional so that you have no way of recovering your data, and your only option at that point is to pay the ransom and hope you get your data back. So immutable storage is largely viewed as a countermeasure to this sort of thing because if you're storing your backups on immutable storage, then ransomware isn't going to be able to go in and delete the backup. It's not going to be able to overwrite the backup or encrypt it or do any sort of damage. Now, having said that, as good as immutable storage is, you really need something else to go along with that. You need some sort of mechanism that can help you to figure out which items have been affected by a ransomware attack versus which haven't. The reason why I say this is because ransomware attacks aren't instantaneous. They take time to complete. So to show you what I mean, let's forget about Microsoft 365 for a moment. And just for the sake of simplicity, let's pretend that you've got a file server and it's got a couple million files on it. And that file server gets hit by ransomware. Well, let's say that that attack starts at 10 a.m. You're not going to have a couple million files that are encrypted by 10:01. It's just not going to happen. Ransomware doesn't work that fast. Even though the ransomware itself might be highly efficient, its capabilities are bound by the underlying hardware. So if your hardware is not capable of encrypting a couple million files in a matter of seconds, the ransomware isn't going to act that quickly. More realistically, that ransomware infection is probably going to happen over a matter of several minutes, possibly even hours, depending on your file system performance, the type of ransomware, and the number of files. So all of that is to say that the infection and the damage caused by the ransomware isn't instantaneous. So let's say in this particular example that ransomware infects a file server, it starts encrypting files, and that the entire process takes, 5 hours to complete. But 2.5 hours in, somebody notices the problem, and they put the brakes on the ransomware infection. So it's been going on for a couple hours, but it hasn't encrypted everything at that point. It probably doesn't make sense to do a full-blown volume level restoration because if you restore the entire volume, you're going to overwrite any new data that's accumulated in the last 2.5 hours. So you've got some users who presumably haven't been affected yet. They don't know anything's wrong, and they're doing their job just as they always have. They're creating new data, they're updating files, and you would lose every bit of that if you perform a volume level restoration. Well, the same basic principle applies to any sort of backups that you're doing to immutable storage to protect against ransomware. You don't want to just restore the contents of that immutable storage as a way of overcoming that ransomware infection. It's a lot better if you can figure out what's actually been affected by the encryption process and then do a very selective restoration to restore only what needs to be restored. That's going to cause the restoration or cause the damage to be fixed a lot more quickly, and it's also going to minimize the amount of data loss that occurs because you're not overwriting new files in the process. So just something to think about. Now, another security feature that's very commonly used with the backups is encryption. But this is one of those things that you have to be careful with because encryption is usually based on the use of encryption keys, and if you lose the encryption keys, then you've got no way of decrypting the data, and you might as well not even have a backup at that point. I've actually seen this happen in the real world. Back in the day when tape backups were super popular, I saw an organization that used a tape drive that held the encryption keys directly at the hardware level inside the tape drive. Well, this organization bought a new tape drive. They didn't give any thought to the encryption keys, and so they got rid of their old tape drive, and then a short time later, they ended up needing to restore a backup that was made on their old tape drive. And of course, the new tape drive couldn't read the tape because it lacked the necessary encryption keys. Again, today, most organizations probably aren't using tape as their primary backup mechanism, But this story does illustrate the point that if you lose the encryption keys, you lose the ability to access your data. So as a best practice, I would recommend keeping multiple copies of your encryption keys, so that way if something happens to one copy, you've still got other copies to fall back on. And make sure that at least one copy of those encryption keys is stored on air-gapped media. That's media that's completely disconnected from your system. Maybe it's a portable hard drive or a USB flash drive that you've written the encryption keys to, unplugged it from the system, and just stored it in a vault somewhere so that you've got it to fall back on in an absolute emergency, and it's in a known good condition, and you don't have to worry about if it's been messed with or anything like that. I'm also a big believer in creating break glass accounts, and you should have at least 2 of these. A break glass account more or less violates every known security protocol in that it's a full-blown administrative account with access to absolutely everything. But this isn't to be used like a normal administrative account because it is so powerful. What you would do is you would create 2 of these break glass accounts because you always want to have some level of redundancy, assign it a super strong password so that nobody would ever be able to guess that password and get into these accounts, and then lock that password in a vault for these accounts never ever to be used unless there's a dire emergency. And then in that case, you could retrieve the passwords, log into the account, and use it to fix whatever problem can't be fixed through other means. But the break glass account should be a last resort. You never want to use that unless you have no other choice. So a few other essential features to look for. Make sure that your backup application supports whatever compliance features you need. It needs to be scalable. As the volume of your Microsoft 365 data grows, your backup needs to be able to grow with that. And you need automated monitoring and alerting. If there happens to be a problem with your backup, you don't want to only find out about that problem when you go to restore something. You need to be alerted to that problem. One last thing that I want to talk about, because I'm getting tight on time here, is not to underestimate the importance of end-user education. Now, this seems like a weird place to go with regard to a subject on backups, but the reason why I'm talking about the subject of end-user education is because there are a couple of pillars of backups. A lot of the Microsoft 365 backup best practices are based around 3 pillars: secure, educate, and protect. Secure is exactly what we've been talking about. It's the idea that your backups need to be kept secure so that they can't be compromised by ransomware or by insider threats or simply by something as mundane as hardware failure. The second pillar is you've got to educate your users. Because let's face it, most data loss events and security breaches that occur today are a result of user error. Maybe a user clicks on something they shouldn't in a phishing email and they unleash a ransomware infection or something like that. So one of your data protection best practices is to educate your end users, because the best type of data recovery situation is a situation in which you mitigate a problem before a recovery ever becomes necessary. So in other words, if you can educate your users and keep them from making the mistakes that normally would require data to be restored, then you never have to worry about restoring that data, and you save yourself a lot of heartache in the process, and you make everybody a lot happier. So education is one of the 3 pillars. And then the third pillar is protect. In other words, make sure that you have a really good backup strategy in place and that you adhere to that backup strategy. So having mentioned the 3 pillars, let me go back to the slide I was on a few moments ago. When I was talking about don't underestimate the importance of user education, because it's a lot easier and less expensive to teach users good habits that help to avoid a data loss event than to try to recover from such events. Yes, you should be able to recover. You definitely need to have the backups in place that will allow you to recover, but it's a lot better for everybody if you can prevent those types of mistakes from being made in the first place. Now, one way that you can do that is through attack simulations. Microsoft 365 has a tool that will allow you to simulate a phishing attack, and there are a few other third-party solutions that will do the same thing. So the idea being that you send these fake phishing emails to your end users, and you see who clicks on them. And if a user does click on it, then maybe you want to enroll them in some mandatory training to help them understand what to look for so they don't fall for phishing attacks in the future. Now, philosophically speaking, I've always been one of these people that believes in trying to leave the users alone to the greatest extent possible and just let them do their jobs and don't bother them unless you absolutely have to. But in contrast to that philosophy, I am a big believer in phishing attack simulations, because once you start doing that, users will get really paranoid about the emails. If they see something that maybe just doesn't look right, they're going to be very, very hesitant to click on that because they don't want to have to go through that mandatory phishing email training that you've put in place. So they're going to be scrutinizing every message that doesn't look 100% legit, and that's going to help reduce security incidents. And in the long run, it's also going to help your backup and recovery strategy because you're probably not going to have to perform as many restorations. So definitely take advantage of user education tools, starting with the attack simulation training feature. And as I mentioned, that is a part of Microsoft 365. Even something like a basic Enterprise E3 subscription, they'll give you one attack simulation training tool that you can use for free without having to purchase any add-ons. So with that said, I am just about out of time. So I do want to make sure that I leave a few minutes here at the end for any questions and answers.
Thanks, Brian. I want to remind everybody that you can still type your questions into the Q&A box at any time, and we will do our very best to get to all of them. Let's go with, we do have quite a few questions coming in. Brian is asking, what level of support does Microsoft provide for customers who have issues with their security or data recovery, and how quickly can we expect a response?
I think it really kind of depends on the situation. It also kind of depends on which tech you end up talking to when you call Microsoft support. I know that's not a super official answer, but that's been the experience that I've had. When different people that I've worked with over the years have called Microsoft regarding a situation that's happened to them, or maybe they've lost some data or they've had a security incident, something like that isn't officially supported typically. So the approach that Microsoft will generally take in this situation, and I'm using the word generally because I don't know for sure that it's policy, is that they will perform best effort. In other words, they want to keep their customers happy. They want to try to help you through the situation, but they don't make any guarantees at that point. So they're going to do what they can, but the outcome is not a foregone conclusion.
Thanks, Brian. Okay, here's one from Annie who's wondering, you talked about backup security. Isn't it better to avoid using any security mechanism that could potentially get in the way of restoring a backup during a critical time?
It's a really delicate balance. There are two schools of thought on that for sure, and I used to be in the camp of avoid using any unnecessary security on your backups because you really don't want some security mechanism to come back and bite you and be getting in your way when you're trying to restore a backup. But that was the time when backups were largely done to tape or they were done entirely on premises, and you were in direct physical control of those backups. Being that so many people back up to the cloud today, you really have to give security much more thought than maybe was necessary in the past when you were in direct physical control of the backup media. So I'm a big believer in backup security, but at the same time, you do have to make sure that you're smart about it and that you don't put something in place that could potentially serve as a stumbling block in the event that a restoration becomes necessary.
Fascinating. Okay, here's one from Zeke who's wondering, Brian, is immutable storage the best defense against ransomware?
I would say that immutable storage is one defense and that it's one of the better defenses, but certainly not the only defense, and whether it's the best defense is kind of up for debate. Every ransomware attack is different. So in my mind, the best defense is making sure that the ransomware attack doesn't happen in the first place. If you do have a ransomware attack, then sure, immutable storage is going to help you to get your data back, and it's going to help you to know that the integrity of that backup has been preserved and that the backup hasn't been altered by ransomware. But it's certainly not the only option, particularly if you're backing up to physical media and you can disconnect that, which is known as an air-gapped backup. That would also have presumably the same level of integrity as immutable storage. That's something that I do in my own organization. I make my normal disk-to-disk backups, but on a periodic basis, a couple of times a week, I'll make an air-gapped backup to a removable hard drive. And as soon as that backup's done, I'll unplug the hard drive, put it in a vault, and I know that backup's good. It hasn't been messed with or anything like that. So if an attack happens, I should be able to restore my normal backups, but if the ransomware happens to destroy those backups, then that air gap backup is kind of a last line of defense for getting everything back.
So interesting. Okay, so here's one from Ronald, who's wondering, how often should end users be educated about phishing attacks?
That's a tough question because it kind of assumes that all end users are alike and that they all think the same way. What I would do if I had an organization with quite a few users and I was having problems with users falling for phishing attacks, I would, at the very beginning, do several tests in rapid succession, just to get the users on their toes, get them really vigilant about looking for those messages. After that, you might taper off a little bit. Nobody needs to be bombarded with tests several times a day or anything like that for an extended period of time. But I would absolutely keep on those tests. At the very least, maybe once or twice a week, but potentially more frequent than that. Just because you never want those users to become complacent and say, oh, they don't do those tests anymore, we don't have to be as careful. You want to be able to trip up those users who are maybe getting a little bit lax about opening emails that they shouldn't.
That thing is, it just never ends. Okay, here's another one from Brian, who's wondering, are there any recommended best practices for configuring and managing Microsoft 365 security settings, and how can we ensure that our organization is following them?
Yeah, there are lots of tools out there. There are certainly Microsoft knowledge base articles on best practices for Microsoft 365 security. That might be a good place to start. There are also tools that are built into Microsoft 365, things like SecureScore, where it will actually go out and analyze your Microsoft 365 configuration, and it will award points based on which security mechanisms you've enabled versus which you haven't enabled, and it will show you actions that you can do to achieve a higher score. Now, having said that, one of the things that you have to be careful about with SecureScore is that Microsoft never intended for people to shoot for a perfect score. A perfect score isn't realistic. Not in the sense that it can't be achieved. You can absolutely achieve a perfect score. But if you do, you're going to lock down your organization to the point that maybe you don't necessarily have the level of functionality that you need. So as you go through those recommendations that SecureScore provides, it's important to weigh each recommendation against the impact that it's going to have on your organization. Some of the recommendations have almost no impact on the end user. Some have a really heavy impact. And then some of the recommendations also have costs associated with them. Like maybe you have to get an Azure Active Directory Premium P2 subscription in order to use a particular recommendation. So you have to consider the cost, the end user impact, and then figure out which of those recommendations are best suited to your business.
Gotcha. Well, we've got time for one more question. I wanted to include this one. Jay is wondering, he's referring to your photograph at the beginning of the presentation. Was that the same lunar set used in 1969? Jay, I hope that was asked.
I'll never tell. I will tell you this.
Go ahead, sorry.
Unofficially, what I've been told about the moon landing, because I've actually asked about that, and who knows if this person knew what they were talking about or not, but what I've been told is that the moon landing was real, but they were prepared to fake it if they had to.
Well, that seems like a good point for us to stop for this session that's making me laugh. Okay, looks like that's all the questions we have time for in this session. We're going to take a short break, but I'll be back at the top of the hour for our third session, Hottest Third-Party Products. Many thanks to Brian Posey for a great session and to our sponsors for making it possible. Now would be a great time to check out those extra resources on your console provided by our sponsors. And remember, folks, during our next session, we'll be giving away a $300 Best Buy gift certificate to one lucky attendee, but you must be present to win. So stick with us. Back in a few.
Welcome back, everybody. John, please take it away.
Thank you, Kevin. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the third and final session of the Microsoft 365 Security and Recovery Summit. Today's event was organized by the hardworking folks at Redmond Magazine, who have brought together some of the best industry experts on today's topic. Many thanks to our sponsors, Druva, provider of the industry's leading SaaS platform for data resiliency, Recovery Point, provider of secure and compliant infrastructure and business resilience services, and Metallic, a Commvault venture provider of enterprise-grade backup solutions, for making this event possible. Thanks, guys. And thanks to you for joining us. I'm John K. Waters, Editor-in-Chief of the Converge 360 Group of 1105 Media, and I'll be your moderator. But before we get started, just a bit of housekeeping. Each of today's sessions is being recorded for later access. Keep an eye out for an email with a link to that recording. It'll be coming your way within the next few days. Each of today's sessions will be followed by a 5 to 10 minute Q&A. There are 3 of them, so stick around. You can type your questions into the Q&A box at any time. Please feel free to add your questions as they occur to you throughout the summit. We will do our very best to get to all of them. Our sponsors have provided some extra resources that can be found on the right-hand side of your screen. Please take a moment to check those out. At the end of the summit, you'll be asked to take a very short survey. Please take a moment to share your honest opinions. Our editors actually read every comment. I'm one of them, so I know it's true. Your opinions helped to shape our future events. And last but not least, at the end of this session, one lucky attendee will be receiving a $300 Best Buy gift card. But you must be present to win, so stick with us. Now let's get started with our third session, Hottest Third-Party Products. For this first of 3 sessions within the session, we've called on Neil Rollins, UK Senior Systems Engineer, and Vanessa Tovis, Microsoft 365 Solutions Architect at Druva. I know you're in for a great session. Take it away, Neil.
Hello and welcome to the session. My name is Neil Rollins and I'm a Senior Engineer at Druva that covers most of public sector as well as the UK. In this subject today, the main thing that I'm going to be talking about is actually protecting your 365 environment, the things how Druva differentiates itself from securing your environment, and the differentiators that you'll find how we back up 365 or larger environments in comparison to other ways of doing it natively or alternatively with other different vendors. The key point that I want to get across is where we're built in the cloud for the cloud. So when we talk about our platform, the entire platform is backed on AWS and object storage. So we'll talk about immutability, governance, logging, auditing, reporting, protection of the platform, as well as cloud concentration risk and some other areas just to be aware of within the 365 portfolio. So to start with, we have some key areas that we're going to talk about around security and protection. We have single sign-on, we have multi-factor authentication, and then we also have a number of other plugins that we can use to add extra security to the platform. We have a recycle bin, so anything that is changed, whether that be maliciously or accidentally, they're held for 7 days, and we can roll those back. And we also have a 24-hour NOC team that manages your back-end data to make sure that if anything was to happen, you'll be notified straight away. Further to the security aspects, your data can be marked as purely immutable, so everything that you back up can be made immutable. Alternatively, any existing backup that we take, so that initial backup or the most recent backup, is made immutable by default. These can be configured, and we also allow self-service, which can be very useful in the portal. Further to the security aspect, something that we talk about a lot is what you can actually access and what your vendor can. So when you back up to Druva, we can't see anything other than the actual bulk of data that you're backing up. So we can see the size, we can see what you're consuming, but that's it. Any other data is not accessible by us. And that is the same for our MSPs if you choose to take an MSP offering. Moving on further into that area, we have extensive logging in our platform, something that very few do in terms of tracking exactly what your users and your admins do. All of that is tracked, and there isn't anything within the platform that can be done without it being logged and a paper trail being left behind for you to audit on and also to see what's happening. To go into that a little bit further, we have in-depth and very, very granular role-based access controls to enable you to break down the functionality of the platform to the help desk users. So if you have a manager and then a help desk, you can break those levels down to allow read, write, restore, and configuration of backups. So that covers off the overall platform security and how we protect different workloads and how we make your lives easier through the teams and the way that it's configured. When we talk about backup, we can back up all the primary core things around 365, the same as a lot of other vendors can. One of the ways that we do differently is that we can back up very, very quickly when we're backing up 365. We're exactly the same as everyone else when it comes to throttling and everything else. But the key point is that when we do take our backups, we're doing it from cloud to cloud, and that leads nicely on to concentration risk. So when you're taking a backup, there's a lot of vendors out there that back up to Azure. So when you're taking a backup of Microsoft 365 data, you're storing that in the same cloud. Now the problem is, if Azure was to go down and you needed access to that data, everything's being held in one location. When we initially talk about backups, whether they be on-premise, in the cloud, or wherever else, the first thing that you're asked is to keep 3 copies of your data in 2 places and have one of them air-gapped or immutable, or something like that. The key thing here is that effectively what you're doing is taking a backup. If it was in on-premises sense, you're taking that backup on-premises and you're storing it in the same place. And that's exactly the same if you're taking a backup in Azure and storing it in the same location. Although you could potentially replicate it to different locations, it's still in the same cloud and you could have access issues around there. So again, in cloud concentration, when you back up to Druva, everything is stored within AWS, and that can be then replicated to different zones or locations dependent on your choice. When you do back up to us, we always hold 3 copies of your data, and that's dependent on where you are. So if you're in the UK, AWS has 3 data zones and they'll be stored in those areas to make sure that there is resiliency in the platform there for you. So just moving on, the next bit that I wanted to touch on is some other features that we have within the portfolio that makes your life that little bit easier. So when we actually take a backup, we ingest that data and we look at what that data is. And by that, what I mean is, not only do we do e-discovery and everything else to make your lives easier when searching for a file when the user needs to find it, but what we can actually do is look at those files and add GDPR, specific governance related issues around that. So for example, we can search back-end data, so we could search for a specific file or folder, file name, or anything you want to remove, and we can remove that both from the backups and also from the front end. And that goes for users as well. So for example, in our platform, if a user leaves your environment or they leave the company, normally they're deleted from on-premises data to make sure that you have the right to be forgotten or GDPR requirements. Something that Druva can do automatically is we can remove that data from the back-end backups as well, enabling you to be compliant and relieving that workload from your managers. Moving on to that, we also cover off the advanced e-discovery and data governance. So we can do litigation hold. You don't need to increase your Microsoft 365 licensing levels. We can do that from our platform and add legal hold there. We can add custodians to those areas to allow certain users to access, download, or view that data. So we also have e-discovery and advanced e-discovery. So when we cover those areas off, that normally leads into GDPR queries and other protection areas. So if I move into GDPR, normally what happens when a user leaves your company is they're deleted from the environment. The first thing you're going to do is potentially convert them to a shared mailbox or mark their account for deletion after a certain period of time. What Druva allows you to do is delete that data on the back end within the backups, which then alleviates the overheads on your IT teams or potentially your HR teams to clear that down. We can also delete data from the back and front end on e-discovery. So if you're searching for a specific user under GDPR or a specific contact, we can search the backup files both at the top level and within the file and remove the file itself from the back end backups and the front end if needed. Something to note with that is that we can also quarantine that information if there is any litigation issues that you may have. Obviously, moving on there, we do have litigation hold. So as you can see, a lot of those functions that are built into the product covers off backup and in the environment itself. So if you are potentially looking at moving your license subscription model within 365 up a level to gain that functionality, I would strongly recommend looking at Druva, because it could mean that you can cover off both of those areas as well as the in-depth level of backups and security that we give you, covering off more areas under a single roof. Something to note is that everything that I talk about today is in a single platform. So when I discussed all these different areas, backing up 365, the fact that we can cover different workloads, we can scan both the backups and front-end data, we do GDPR, role-based access, security, all of this is in a single interface and protected by Druva. You don't have to have multiple products, multiple interfaces. You don't have to download your data and then move that data from a proxy or something else into immutable storage. It's just all backed up from one location into the Druva cloud and protected, and exactly the same if you want to do a recovery. There's no complications there, there's no complexity. It's very much a turnkey solution with a single pane of glass interface. And again, from there, you can scale out those workloads. Start with 365 and expand them into different workloads within the environment. Further to this, just if you wanted to move into different areas, we have extensive login. We also have security command centers. So if you're trying to protect your 365 environment, we can do geofencing. We can also look at who's actually accessing the backup platform, what API calls there are, and where your data is located, whether that be multiple geos or single locations. If you have a diverse business set or a number of different offices across different regions, as opposed to having all those regions back up into a single location, we can take those backups and we can store them in different AWS regions, still with that resiliency of 3 different copies in the region, dependent on where you're backing that up. Or you can have zone resiliency and copy that between different countries if that's something you wanted to achieve. So again, the platform, single pane of glass, no matter where you are, copying into the AWS cloud. There's no need to go through proxies, all to a central site, central storage. And again, the performance of AWS is in the back of our product. Just to close off on that point, so the main thing that we can offer you really is a secure platform. It's easy to deploy, it's easy to manage. You can keep everything under one roof, and most importantly, we're secure. If you go to security.druva.com, you will see all of our certifications. We have FIPS, FedRAMP, GDPR, ISO 27001, and a number of other security certifications there. And if you do choose to go through a POC or become one of our customers, you can log in there and download all of those certificates and certifications for yourself to enable your business to provide them, whether that be for insurance purposes or just generally for regulatory purposes. Everything is readily accessible, and you can get that from your Druva rep, or alternatively, as I said, you can request access from security.druva.com.
Hi, everybody. Sorry, I realized that we were live. This is John K. Waters, and I'd like to set up a Q&A here. Thank you, Neil. We're going to call on Druva's Microsoft 365 Solutions Architect, Vanessa Tovis, for this Q&A session. Remember, you can type your questions into the Q&A box at any time. We'll do our best to get to all of them. Hi, Vanessa.
Hello, hello. How are you doing?
I'm good. So we've got a bunch of questions coming in. I'm going to start with this kind of a long one from Mario, who's wondering, I have a client with many workstations with Windows 11 and 10 with SQL databases on them. Druva won't let me install the hybrid workloads client on the workstation. I would like to know if there is a solution that will back up these workstations as servers on SQL, on the SQL layer of backup, similar to hybrid workloads. We tried Druva InSync, but that won't do the work as this is a simple file backup with limited data. Phew, long question. What do you think?
Yes. I'll tell you what. Number one, I'm not the hybrid workload kind of person. However, here's what I do know. Oftentimes, it's not so much necessarily a platform like a Druva. It could be what APIs are available, and it could also be the version of SQL Server that's being used, or if it's SQL Express or SQL Server Developer, any one of those types of things. I know that we have quite a few different type of configurations, and I'm not sure when Mario, when you've last talked to someone, but I'm sure we can take this question a little bit further with maybe another teammate of mine that can do it more justice. So.
Okay, we've got one here from Jay who's wondering, is it a fair statement to say that Druva can replace certain functionalities provided through higher tier Microsoft licensing?
Oh, I don't like to say that. I mean, the reality is, like higher tier licensing, I would say that's an E5. That's like the highest tier licensing. Companies make business decisions to go to a higher tier licensing for a number of reasons, whether it is to use the more in-depth e-discovery, if it's to use, Power BI, there's a number of reasons. So I'm a huge proponent of anyone going and, an organization saying a higher tier license is right for us, number one, whatever the business needs are. Now, where Druva comes in is that there are natural gaps of data loss or potential data loss in Microsoft, and we fill a gap. So we're not a collaboration platform. We don't have a dashboard tool. We don't have, a Power Automate. We don't have any of those types of services, and we don't compete against that. But we absolutely do complement and support a company's investment in Microsoft 365, regardless of license.
Thank you. So here's one from Ronald. I'm sorry. Here's one from Ronald. I wasn't sure, but I thought it was said that if a file or data is found to be compromised, that it can be quarantined. Is that correct?
Yeah, absolutely. With our backup platform, absolutely. So, and where user data is concerned, where we protect is on two fronts. The laptop, desktop, endpoint devices, number one. And we can't forget that. Regardless of if a company is using Google or Microsoft 365, believe me, users will still save data to their endpoints. So we can't forget that, number one. Number two, the user data that's coming out of 365, that's email from the active mailbox, the online archive. Even for us, we back up the recoverable items. And then the OneDrive. So part of our discovery of our data governance feature is to be able to look across the endpoint devices, right? I'm an admin and I need to find whether it's a data spillage, whatever it is, and I'm searching for a file, a hash or something, and I'm going to find it for this user on their endpoint and out of their mailbox and potentially in their OneDrive. And I can have some options. I can quarantine that. I quarantine it like they can't access it or do anything against that. But I also have the ability to, and we apply RBAC to this particular feature too, to either delete it out of all the snapshots or delete it from the snapshots and even the source. It's the only area. This is why RBAC is it's huge. When you have a platform that doesn't have really in-depth, detailed RBAC for functions and features, you have to challenge that. So yes, you can quarantine that file, number one. You also can delete it out of your snapshots or even delete it out of the source if you need to.
Fascinating. Thank you so much, Vanessa. That's all the time we have for these questions. If we didn't get to yours, we'll pass them along to our speakers, and they'll get back to you. Our next presenters are Matthew Goddard and Jeff Judy. Matthew is the product manager, and Jeff is chief cloud architect. both at Recovery Point Systems. Take it away, Matthew and Jeff.
Yeah, perfect. Thanks, John. To just start us off with a little bit about who we are, not necessarily as individuals, but more at Recovery Point. So Recovery Point is the industry model for true end-to-end recovery and continuity solutions. As an award-winning nationwide leader in data protection and business resiliency services, we serve organizations ranging from Fortune 500 to SMBs, as well as federal, state, and local governments as examples. Now, we have the experts, the technology, and the platform to ensure resiliency and recovery across changing cyber threats and technology environments. Our focus is on one goal and promise, and that's to protect the performance of your business. And today I'll be talking to you about the M365 specific service that we've launched to help keep your data protected. So you use Office 365 critical applications like Exchange and SharePoint every day. And when it comes to protection, they should be treated the same as your on-premise critical applications. It's not enough just to have a second copy saved in the cloud. I mean, if your account credentials were compromised or even a disgruntled employee, let's say, gets in the mix, it only takes a few clicks of the mouse for everything to be removed and emptied, right? And over our years of experience, we've seen that unfortunate situation happen firsthand. I mean, there's a reason the backup standard guidelines state having copies of data in different locations separate from the primary source. And that's why it's a crucial piece of a healthy DR plan. So this gives you protection against not just the small accidents, but of course the larger deliberate ones as well. And backup and recovery with Recovery Point Systems does exactly that. You get all the features of offsite backup, and your data is saved in a Tier 3 certified secure data center. We manage the hardware, the software, the licensing, and all the storage requirements for you. There's nothing to deploy on-premise or even inside your M365 account. It's super, super easy. And with a wealth of options for backup policies and schedules, as well as different restore options, we have you covered. You can restore a single piece of data or email if you want to, all the way up to entire mailboxes or folders. And you have full end-to-end backup and recovery solution available to you without having to deploy anything. Letting Recovery Point Systems manage your M365 backup service means continuous monitoring and review of your protection to identify gaps and areas that could pose risk for your data recovery. Our team of US-based managed service professionals are servicing all of our clients' environments, our own data centers, and now, of course, the M365 backup service 24/7. And we utilize many different reports giving different insights into your recoverability posture, and we use these to make sure that you're operating in the best situation that's possible. And when we see a problem, we'll let you know, and we'll work with you to resolve it. Think of us as just an extension to your IT recovery team, knowing that if an issue arises, we're there to help you, and that's one less thing for you to have to worry about. And also on that note, I mean, we know you're busy, and of course we're always there to help, right? But allowing your users to manage their own restores without having to involve your own IT staff saves everybody time. The M365 backup and recovery with Recovery Point Systems lets your users recover their own data for those accidental deletions or removals that might have happened. And I mean, I don't care to admit how many times my OneDrive autosave gets turned on and I might override some changes that I don't discover until later, right? With some super easy search capabilities presented through a very familiar interface, your users are only a few mouse clicks away from that important email or file being back exactly where it was, and they can continue on working. And of course, your administrators have full access to mailbox backups, channel groups, etc., if needed. You have lots of different restore options depending on the severity and the nature of the work disruption. And of course, our M365 backup and restore service is just an extension to our already existing backup as a service offerings that we have in market today. We know there's no one-size-fits-all when it comes to data protection, and that's why we approach and apply the best-of-breed solutions to help clients keep their RPOs monitored and on target. And it's how we're able to help meet the recovery times of our clients when the need arises. Recovery Point Systems has, in total, hundreds of years of experience protecting clients' data and managing the recovery for applications on all platforms. And that's all the way from the popular, x86 systems, all the way to AIX, IBM Power I, and mainframes. And our DRaaS protection services focus on the data protection and recovery for your entire infrastructure and application ecosystem. And the M365 backup and replication is just an addition to that great set of recovery solutions we offered today. By working with Recovery Point for your data protection requirements, you can be confident that your organization is ready for any kind of disruption. We have a number of resources you can use to learn more about our capabilities, including the new 365 backup and recovery that I've spoken about today. And more information can be found in the resources section, including a link to our product pages where you can easily contact us for further discussion about your particular environment if you choose. And we would love to help you become better protected. And with that, thank you for the time today, and we're happy to take any questions as I pass it back to John.
Awesome, thank you. So let's just jump right in. We've got a question here from, looks like it's from Manny, who's wondering, where is your data center located? That's a simple question.
Thanks, John. I'll take that one. This is Jeff Judy. So our data centers, we're located in Germantown, Maryland, Gaithersburg, Maryland, and out in Mount Prospect, Illinois. Just a bit about us. As Matthew said, we're an Uptime Institute Tier 3 certified data center. And we've got multiple skill sets. We're a pure disaster recovery pure play with delivery services for mainframe, IBM P series, x86, as well as the Azure solutions.
Gotcha. So here's one from Anthony, who's wondering, does Recovery Point meet CJIS compliance?
I'm sorry. Could you repeat that one?
Absolutely. Does Recovery Point meet CJIS compliance? I apologize. I don't know what those initials mean.
Sure. So, well, I'm not exactly sure. I'll tell you, though, our compliance is a long list, but just a few of them were the NIST 853 framework compliant, PCI DSS certified, SOC 2, and FISMA.
Anthony is clarifying. He's saying that CJIS is Criminal Justice Information Systems.
I see. I'm not familiar with that one. I'd have to make note of that.
Okay. So Mario is wondering, what about PCI compliance?
Yes, PCI DSS certified.
Okay, gotcha. So here's one from Annie. It looks like she's wondering, if I have my Office 365 deployed in a hybrid environment or a hybrid model with with on-prem, can I use you as a second or third location to hold my backups?
Yes, definitely. So you can send us, what Veeam does is send us backup copy jobs. We're agnostic to the solution, but we're a partner and service provider for Veeam software. So I like to talk about it in that framework. But we provide S3 compatible object storage. So most vendors today are compatible with able to send copy jobs for your M365 data sets out to object storage. So we'll be compatible, and you can send us a secondary copy or a tertiary copy if you just needed a landing spot to kind of archive the data.
Gotcha. So here's one from Ahmed, who's got a Microsoft question here. Does Microsoft charge for ingress and egress of data movement from Office 365?
That's a good question. So they do not actually. So there's no utility fee there to move the data.
Gotcha. Okay, here's another one. If I lost all my data one day, could your service restore it?
Yes. So we are purpose-built for disaster recovery services. So M365 is one of the many services we offer. And we offer both in a self-service model, like part of what Matthew was presenting there, with a self-service portal that you can access. And that's built for more maybe a loss of a file or an email. And then we can deliver fully recovered services for you and run the restoration process. And so what we're talking about today would be the M365 suite, and we would have all those data sets so we can restore back to your Azure organization, as well as the other recovery services we have as well. So, we can recover your x86, your mainframe, your power systems, your AS400 systems, things like that.
Gotcha. Okay, this attendee is wondering, do you offer Microsoft SSO integration for my users?
That's good. So that's single sign-on authentication, and we fully integrate with your Azure organization. We actually have a pretty helpful PowerShell script that it's a simple thing to run, and it builds the accounts that we require to access your Azure organization to properly access the Exchange and SharePoint and OneNote and things like that, and then run the backups. And then within the self-service portal, you're able to enter your own Active Directory ID and authenticate through that portal to run your own self-service services to run recoveries if you needed to.
Awesome. Okay, I'm looking here. So how about this question? Do you, and Recovery Point Systems, do you support immutable backups?
Yes, we do. That's what I was talking about just a few minutes ago. So our object storage, especially with M365, so we're going to back up into our own co-located object storage systems that supports what's called object locking. So Veeam will set the immutability bit, and really what that means is, once the data is backed up, it cannot be altered. It can't be changed or deleted in any way.
Okay, so here's one from Anthony. Would your organization have access to our data if you're managing it? If so, what processes are in place to prevent compromise?
So we do, to back up your data, we will need access to Azure to back the data sets up. So we're fully audited as far as security incident and event management, things like that, and logging capabilities. So being able to audit the who, what, when, and where for reporting should incidents happen is part of the service.
So here's one from Dan. He's wondering, can different mailboxes be backed up using different rules, user mailbox versus shared mailbox?
Yes, definitely. You can set different backup policies. And, that's actually, the service is built towards that kind of setup. So you might have a CEO, CIO that you need to retain their mailbox data for a couple years, and they have larger mailbox sets, and those are your critical mailbox users that always must have access and their data backed up. So you can set up different backup policies versus, an account that maybe you don't even need to really have any retention past maybe 30 days, and then you can just set up various policies to accommodate the business requirements.
Fascinating. Okay, here, this one just came in from Cam, who's wondering, do you have storage in Germany?
No, we are U.S.-based only. Sorry about that.
Okay. Okay. That's
Germantown,
okay.
Maryland.
Let's see. We've got time for. Say again.
I said we're Germantown, Maryland.
Germantown, Maryland. Well, that's okay. Not Germany, but Germantown. Okay.
Yeah.
We do have time for one more question. This one from Annie, who's wondering, can you restore my data for me? That seems pretty basic.
Yes, we can. Like I said, we offer, we're 24/7 for support. So, if it's not a disaster, you just have a mailbox that got deleted accidentally, call up the support line, and we'll run the restoration for you. So we're fully managed. We're a pure disaster recovery company. So we'll do everything for you as far as, we can just recover a simple email message, mailbox, SharePoint, OneNote, all the way up to full disaster recovery of all systems. So that's what we're built for, and that's what we do.
Awesome. Hey, thank you so much, guys. So we're ready to go on to our third hot product. Let's see. Our next presenters are Caitlin Carollo, sales engineer, and Michael Sherritt, senior product marketing manager at Metallic. We're going to hear from Caitlin. So take it away, Caitlin.
Hi, my name is Caitlin Carollo, and I'm a sales engineer with Metallic at Commvault. Today, we're going to be discussing how to be recovery ready in Microsoft 365. As the use of SaaS applications is increasing across many organizations, especially Microsoft 365, not only are we seeing increases to productivity of customers and their users, but also increases to the risk of data loss. There's a couple different areas that we're seeing data loss increase, especially in the context of these SaaS applications. The first of which being data corruption due to data being modified due to service unavailability or a complication from an integration. We're also seeing data loss due to malicious attacks, whether it be an external attack like ransomware or an internal bad actor, such as a disgruntled employee bleeding data on their way out of an organization. And then, of course, we're also seeing instances of accidental deletion. All people are human, whether they're users or admins, and people make mistakes, including deleting something that they shouldn't or changing something that shouldn't be edited. SaaS applications, including Microsoft 365, follow what's called a shared responsibility model. This is where Microsoft or the SaaS application provider will outline what the customer is responsible for in terms of the service versus what they as the provider are responsible for in that service. In the case of Microsoft, Microsoft is responsible for the availability of the application, making sure that when you log in, your data pops up quickly and that the service runs as you expect it to from any location. On the flip side, you'll see the customer responsibility is actually for the information and the data within that application. This is why Microsoft recommends third-party data protection to ensure that the content that users are creating and modifying that is really what's valuable to each individual organization is protected. Now, there's a few different reasons why you would want to have a dedicated backup solution like Metallic to protect your Office 365 data. There are native tools within Microsoft 365 that can help safeguard your data, but it's not going to be at the level that a dedicated backup solution will give. Native tools don't provide data separation, so any data that's within Office 365 is production. Now, with a dedicated backup solution, you'll have an isolated backup that's separate from the source, so that if that data in production is infected or modified, that you do have that separate copy that will be residing in an isolated location, so that once the primary environment is secured, you can then recover from that isolated copy. Native tools will also give you things like the recycle bin, but we know that there's limitations to how long data will stay in the recycle bin. With a dedicated solution, you can have long-term extended retention beyond the timeframes of the recycle bin or the recoverable items folder. A dedicated solution like Metallic allows you to customize that retention and keep the data for long-term, even if that's years. And this is really great, especially in the event that you need to review data from users that have left the company or that has since been deleted years down the line, for example, in a legal or compliance scenario. Native tools will also only have baseline recovery controls and no specific retention or restore SLAs, whereas a dedicated solution will have flexible options for rapid recovery, as well as dedicated controls so that everything is policy driven in terms of when the backups run, as well as how long the data is retained for. Now, thinking about Metallic, Metallic is a solution built from Commvault. And Commvault is an organization that has been in the backup and recovery space for more than 25 years. Commvault has a long history of working closely with Microsoft since even the early days of protecting our customers' data. And Metallic is a solution that was built by Commvault on the core technology that we've always used with our customers to protect their data. Metallic was designed as a solution to reduce the overhead of managing infrastructure of a backup solution so that customers have a lightweight way to consume their backup and recovery software, and they can consume that software in a way that's similar to how they're using other applications in the cloud, such as Microsoft 365. Metallic is really software as a service, but for your backup and recovery. So it's built on Azure. It's a cloud-based solution and will allow you to have cloud-to-cloud backup of your Microsoft 365 data, in addition to a wide range of other workloads that can be protected. Now we'll jump into a demonstration and take a quick look at the console. Here we're looking at the Metallic solution console, and you can see here on the main page we've got a look at the service catalog, which shows all of the different applications that can be protected within Metallic. We'll focus on Office 365, but the idea here is that Metallic can grow with you. So if you start out by protecting Microsoft 365 and your needs change and you need to expand, you can keep all of those workloads under one roof with Metallic. Now, if we take a look at Office 365, we'll get some high-level information about what we're currently protecting. Office 365 protection will cover all 4 of the major applications: Exchange Online, OneDrive, SharePoint Online, and Teams. And we can see the accounts for those data sources respectively. Now, to get this set up, it's really quick and easy, and there's no infrastructure required. With Metallic being software as a service, we really don't want there to be a ton of infrastructure overhead, if any. And with a cloud-to-cloud backup, we can keep things really simple so that you can get this configured and start running your backups right away. When we look to configure an application, we'll ask us to give our app a name, in this example, maybe Exchange, then sign in with Microsoft. This is going to connect through Microsoft's OAuth process, so Metallic is not managing any of these credentials. You'll log in as a tenant administrator and then grant Metallic the permissions to read the data out of your tenant and then write the data back in on Restore. What it will do with these credentials, or not the credentials, but with the permissions, is assign those permissions to an Azure app that's going to be created within your Office 365 tenant. This is all workflow-based so that we can leverage the Microsoft APIs to grab the data as well as write it back in on Restore. And the whole process is automated. And when it comes to actually managing your applications, you'll be able to take a look at the backup health dashboard where you can see your current SLAs. So if you see green, means your backups are running successfully. And then you could also see if there's anything that hasn't been backed up recently or that was never backed up, which is really helpful to make sure that you're fully covered. And then we can go into the applications themselves. So for example, with Exchange Online, we can take a look at the application as a whole or go to the specific mailboxes that each have a retention policy assigned. We can also manage these users via AD groups. So if we want to have policies assigned to groups of people instead of individuals, that's another great way to automatically pull users into certain backup policies and retentions. Then when it comes to the actual restores, we can either recover a whole mailbox or the individual messages. And this is true for all 4 applications. We can always restore the whole entity, whether it's a mailbox, a SharePoint site, a OneDrive, or a team. Or we can go in and get granular. and look at the actual content that we're going to restore. So for example here, if Michael deleted some emails out of his mailbox by mistake and they got filtered out by the recycle bin, we can actually come in, select those specific emails that he needs recovered, and then perform that restore. When we do that restore, we'll see we can either do an in-place recovery. So in the event that there was ransomware and we just need to bring that data back to the original location, or the delete use case I just mentioned, but we can also do out-of-place recoveries. Now, this is key if, for example, this user has left the company and his mailbox doesn't exist anymore, but we do still need to bring that data back and review it. We can go and select a different destination, in this case, a separate user, and then specify what folder we want that data to go into on that recovery. This is really helpful because there's flexibility in that destination, and oftentimes we'll be retaining data outside of the lifespan of a given mailbox or user account. These options are present regardless of which application you're looking at. So for OneDrive, we can do the same thing, in place and out of place, and same goes for SharePoint and Teams respectively. With a solution like this, you can make sure that you're fully covered when it comes to your backups, that your backups are stored in a separate, isolated location, and that data is secured. One, because we're going to always be encrypting your data both in flight and at rest with AES 256-bit encryption, and you do benefit from that virtual air gap between your production environment and your backups, because we're going to be putting that data in a cloud-based storage repository. But then you also have the flexibility and ease of use of just logging into the service, choosing the data that needs to be recovered, and then specifying that destination. It's enterprise-grade security combined with simplicity so that you can just focus on protecting your Office 365 data. Thank you so much, and have a great day.
Thank you, Caitlin. Now let's get to some questions from our attendees. For Metallic Senior Product Marketing Manager, Michael Sherritt. Remember, you can type your questions into the Q&A box at any time. We'll do our best to get to all of them. So, let's see here. Hi, Michael. Are you with us?
I am. Thank you.
Hey, okay. So let's just start with this pretty simple question here. Why do customers need to back up Microsoft 365?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And as Caitlin talked about, right, it really all goes back to the shared responsibility model, right? Mm-hmm. So at the end of the day, you are responsible for that data. And there's a host of benefits that go along with backing up M365 that are complementary in addition to what you get with the native backup when you choose that subscription, right? So you're getting things like deduplication, you're getting compression. There's just a wealth of additional features that go towards making you more efficient and, at the end of the day, providing you with the best possible TCO when you're using M365.
Mm-hmm. Gotcha. Okay, here's one from Brian who's wondering what training and support resources are available to help our employees understand and use the security and recovery features of Microsoft 365 effectively.
Yeah, Brian, we have a wealth of options available. Our support is available by email, by chat, by phone. We also have a number of training courses that can be implemented on your corporation's behalf. You can use those in a train-the-trainer format, or they can take those courses directly. We have a resource library that's available on the website that's extremely deep. And of course, our SEs are always available to do in-depth training for teams or for, leads, team leads, as well as individuals as needed. So we're pretty flexible in that regard. This is something that we do a lot of and are always happy to help in a way that fits your needs.
Okay, thanks. So here's one from Cam. He's wondering, he or she is wondering, sorry about that, are Office 365 files stored in an object storage system?
They are. So that is something that we offer. If you look at our hybrid cloud portfolio, in addition to our SaaS products like M365, Dynamics 365, Salesforce, we also have a host of offerings on the hybrid cloud side, which include databases, Kubernetes and VMs, as well as file and object. And so what I would like to point out is that is available for both the Metallic offering as well as the Commvault offering. So that is available, whether you're using Commvault software or if you're using Metallic SaaS.
Thank you. So here's one from Jeremy. He's wondering, how are companies like we have heard from today secure from breaches and vulnerabilities?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. And I think what you're seeing, and I heard an earlier speaker reference this, right? At the end of the day, the best defense is to not get ransomware, right? But I also hear a lot of people saying it's not a question of when, it's a question of if. Personally, and from a Metallic and a Commvault perspective, we look at it a different way, right? So we have products like ThreatWise that do cyber deception. If you think back to sort of how the landscape looked, even 5-6 years ago, right? We had managed antivirus, and that was kind of the standard. And then we moved to EDR, right? And then it was XDR. And now we've kind of come full circle to where the question of, can I restore my data and make myself whole, is the ultimate backup protection. So again, best defense is a good offense. I will say, utilizing things like cyber deception, we use honeypots so that we know if a bad actor is in that environment before they actually, get into your production environment, and you can take the appropriate actions there to shut that down. But let's just say hypothetically you were to be hit by ransomware. We offer something called Metallic Recovery Reserve, which is available on both Azure as well as Oracle Cloud Infrastructure. That is immutable storage, and that's something that I heard referred to earlier today as well. I do believe that immutable storage is the way to go, right? To be able to be in a situation where once that data is locked up in a vault, it's untouchable. That's what really matters, is that the data is restored 100% in the manner that it was backed up as. And so I would say, you do need very proactive threat detection, but immutable storage is a great way to do it, as well as managing your daily backups as well.
We've got time for one more quick question. This is from Ahmed, who's wondering, can I back up Dynamics 365? If not, is it on the company's roadmap, that capability?
Yes. Yeah. Thanks, Ahmed. You actually can. You can back up Dynamics 365. There is a data sheet, among other things, that's available on our website. That's on the Metallic side of the house. It's only available for Metallic at the moment. But again, that is, true SaaS backup. It gives you that granular control for D365, multi-layer security that's air-gapped, as I just discussed, with Metallic Recovery Reserve. But in addition to everything that we offer with M365, being able to back up Exchange Online, Teams, SharePoint, OneDrive, Project, we also offer Dynamics 365 as well. So thank you.
Well, thank you, Michael, and thank you, Caitlin. That's all the time we have for questions. If we didn't get to yours, we'll pass them along to our speakers, and they'll get back to you. And now it's time to announce the winner of our $300 Best Buy gift card. One lucky attendee's name has been drawn from the digital hat, so to speak. And the winner is Steve Brim from TrueRx. Congratulations, Steve. Our team will be in touch with you soon on how to claim your $300 Best Buy gift card. Well, that's it, folks, for today's summit. Many thanks to Druva, Recovery Point, and Metallic, a Commvault venture, for making this event possible. And thanks to you all so much for joining us. We will get your replay email of this event in the next few days. We'll get it to you. We hope you enjoyed this summit and came away with some insights and actionable intel. And please, your input on today's summit in the survey that pops up when you exit. Thank you very much. Bye, everyone, for now.